Boy.
All my life I wanted to fly like the birds that you see way up in the sky. Making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one.
Bogus.
Be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Well, I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Good evening.
I
Well,
don't want to see you around here anymore.
he's still right where he was, Rocket.
Beat it, buddy.
Welcome into episode 1.18 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History. So, let's get some things about this episode out of the way. Everyone mentioned it during the intro and the warm-up. Why the heck is Talleyrand on the topics? That's because we're entering the most complicated phase of the French Revolution. And so tonight's episode is going to do the setup of the National Convention. This is what happened during the National Convention's early days. One of the things that happened during the National Convention's early days is they were laser focused on putting Louis the 16th on trial. But that in of itself is such a big thing that is what next week is going to be entirely about. It's not possible in the context of how much time I wish an episode to be to talk about this is how the National Assembly was generally speaking in its first couple months, and then also talk about what was happening on the war front, and then also talk about just how complex the trial of Louis XVI was. So half of tonight's episode is about the National Convention. The other half is going to take a in-depth look at the early life and times of our friend Talleyrand. Up until this point, you're all right, he's in England right now in terms of where we are in our narrative, but we have never been able to bring him to the forefront and discuss who he is and what he did even before the revolution. So we're going to do that tonight. And this is going to be something that happens every now and again from now on, because there are individuals who I haven't been able to give the focus that's necessary, because they're never the top three people that are involved in any one thing we've talked about. Talleyrand's been extremely influential throughout all of this, but he's always just been Talleyrand, just a little bit into the background, because that's his survival instinct. We're going to get into his life in the whole second half of tonight's episode. Where he came from, how he evolved as a person, how he and what he did throughout everything we already know about so far in the revolution, and then kind of give him that send-off we gave to Lafayette last week, where it was like, okay, this guy's not going to be around for a while. Let's just make sure you know where he's going to be. Put him in your pocket. We're going to bring him back. That's why Talleyrand is topic number 4 tonight. As I said, next week is very easy to predict. It'll be the trial of Louis XVI and what happens at the outcome of that trial. But tonight will be completely about the first half, that National Convention, and how they conducted themselves, apart from the trial, for that first month or so of their existence. So, as you will recall, France had been facing that perma-noob with the host. By the way, Rocket, thanks for the host. Number 98, 5 months at Tier 1 as well. Thank you very much. You guys will also notice down along the bottom of the main viewing area, I have increased the Scare Drive goal to 2,000.
Duke is on deck.
That $2,000 will be a nice to hit. I don't have a stretch goal for it, but I know that a meter without a full meter motivates people, so we've increased that just to see how close we can get to it. It's all right, Permanoob. Welcome back in. Permanoob is on your leaderboard, by the way, everyone. Ahead of Gilly right now. So you'll recall that France had been facing the Allied army, which was had taken the forts at Longwy and Verdun, and that Georges Danton had called for 30,000 volunteers from Paris to go fight, but they were reluctant to go fight because they feared that all those prisoners that had been rounded up in Danton's house-to-house searches would, somehow just break out of prison simultaneously and go murder all their loved ones. And then Jean-Paul Marat was given that seat on the surveillance committee within the insurrectionary commune government. And then in early September, sans-culotte mobs started to, lynch prisoner transport wagons, and they pushed into prisons and held kangaroo court tribunals, which executed prisoners that were held there en masse. And then Marat then led his committee to institutionalize that gang murder, and the recently authorized tribunals, as a part of everything that had gone down in the wake of the insurrection of August the 10th, held quick justice sessions, didn't stop, but streamlined that gang murder process. And then the French army turned back the invading allies at Valmy, which only occurred because the Duke of Brunswick decided to not just reconstitute his lines, but to retain his army entirely, and he withdrew from France. And those 20,000 of the 30,000 sans-culottes that Danton wanted didn't have anything to do with that victory. They would eventually get out there and reinforce the French army, but in the Battle of Valmy, they had no impact. So, in that bloody power vacuum that existed between the insurrection of August the 10th and the collapse of the Constitution of 1791 up to the point of the National Convention, no one was really completely in control or in charge, and it led to that bloody massacre of people simply deemed suspect under that new law of suspects that we talked about last week. Allied army allergic to music, that's fair. So the dangerous 6-week period of trying to figure out who was in charge of what led to the massacres in September. It ended with the convening of the National Convention, which had been ordered by the Legislative Assembly on August 10th in that really super nervous session where they were pretty much in a go along to get along, please don't murder us, you're banging down our doors type of way. The stated purpose of the National Convention when it convened was to write a new constitution for France. That was why it had been called, right? The people in Paris had pretty much deemed the Constitution of 1791 a failure, and everyone in the Legislative Assembly had just been like, uh-oh, well, we're done, let's get out of here with our skin, let's create this National Convention so that they basically can deal with this. And the deal with this part was, well, obviously there needs to be a new government system here in France, because this one, which lasted 11 months, didn't work. Well, it could have worked, it just wasn't given enough time to work. Yeah, it's a failure because no one wanted to follow it. That's an absolutely accurate statement. It's a failure because no one was supporting it, and I did foreshadow that pretty heavily in the first days of the Legislative Assembly. But as events twist and turn and advance, constitutions get written here, and they get advanced, and they get suspended after they've been advanced, and they get rewritten, and the convention itself will end up serving as the de facto legislative body of France from now, September 1792, until November 1795, which means it will far outlast the Legislative Assembly, and it's going to outlast the National Assembly in terms of how much time it was around for. Actually, no, it's going to be just short of the National Assembly. But the battles that were waged in and over the Constitution that are written and the Convention itself will define the absolutely worst of the worst days of the French Revolution. So from now on, especially into 1793, you're going to feel time stretch back out on us again. We had that summer in 1789 into the fall where we barely made any real progress on the calendar. And it's going to be that way again now. This is the great tornado of the French Revolution. From now until pretty much 1794, it's really, really complex and detailed. Yeah, we're out of the new eye of the storm completely. The new eye of the storm was the spring of 1792. We're way past that now. And what's going to happen now, especially starting with Louis' trial next week, is going to be a little crazy. More than that. More than a little.
Yes, I'm excited about this.
So as I said, this episode's going to focus on the acrimonious start to the violent and disturbing adventure that the National Convention finds itself on. So elections for this convention were called by that really super nervous and very lightly attended session of the Legislative Assembly on August the 10th, 1792. While the sans-culottes, who had simultaneously been fighting a gunfight in the Tuileries Palace, had been basically banging down the door of the menage. The leadership of the Legislative Assembly were not really all that thrilled about dumping the Constitution of 1791 and starting over from scratch, especially the Girondins, you'll remember, because the Girondins had been trying to cultivate that working relationship with the crown. Well, that's all over, and no one, but especially the Girondins, was really happy about having to dump the Constitution, because the Girondins were largely in power, both in the Assembly and within the Jacobins. But the smoke from the fighting at the Tuileries Palace was still visibly hanging in the air, and they decided that it was really a situation where they had little choice if they didn't want an angry mob gutting them the same way that the Swiss Guard had just been slaughtered. So Brissot and his Girondin allies, without a doubt, all kind of shuddered and had chills when they approved these elections for the national conventions, which were based on universal manhood suffrage, which eschewed that whole active-passive citizenship distinction for their eligibility to vote across France. And that had been a point of contention since it had been conceived. You remember that from basically the moment that active passive citizenship was a thing, where you had to be of a certain age and pay a certain amount in taxes to be considered an active citizen, that it had been a wedge between the bourgeois and the sans-culottes. But the Girondins in the out format, going out of the Legislative Assembly as things were really winding down and they were formalizing the process of the National Convention and how people would be elected to it, were able to sneak in two pieces of procedural technicalities that would soften the blow of everybody gets to vote. So first, they stuck with the same two-tiered electoral system, which, for those who have viewed this and been in this series with us the whole way, should be very familiar with at this point, where there was a primary assembly who nominated an elector, and then that elector moved up to an upper assembly where the votes for delegates would actually take place. So it was an indirect electoral system. And technically, that's how we vote for president, by the way, in the United States. We don't vote for president, we vote for an elector. Still works that way. Probably should do something about that. But in the eyes of the Girondins, this would...
Oh, never getting it again.
But in the eyes of the Girondins, this would hopefully kind of lock out the type of delegate that, if there was a direct democratic vote, that would lead to, right? We would keep out the crazy types of people, right, if we had this whole two-tiered electoral system. And it generally did, and sometimes it didn't. Second, the Girondins managed to resist Robespierre again calling for the Legislative Assembly to pass that self-denying decree that the National Assembly had taken upon themselves, and we've all looked at retrospectively and been like, what were they thinking? Right? That whole, well, if you serve in this body, you cannot serve in the first session of the next body. The National Assembly did that, and I believe we all think that was a really, really bad mistake, because it left no one there to defend what had just been done. Now, the circumstances here are different. The National Assembly was leading France into the Legislative Assembly in the Constitution of 1791 in a relatively peaceful situation. The Legislative Assembly's handing off things to the National Convention in sheer utter chaos, where there is no government at the moment that occurs. There's no king. But they didn't get that passed onto the Legislative Assembly, that self-denying decree. The decree, again, had forbidden those people from going into the Legislative Assembly, but the Legislative Assembly recognized that, look, you're asking, we're asking for the electorate pool, those who can vote, to be universal here. Universal if you're a male, yes, but universal. It's no longer based on property and taxes. If you're male in France and basically not a servant, you can vote. But if that's true, then they argued that the candidate pool must also be universal. And so people who you are familiar with will move right on into the National Convention. All ladies are now Madame Roland. If that was true, it would turn out a whole lot differently. Madame Roland is a very distinctly unique individual. So the first round of elections were held on August 27, 1792, which was just about the time, if you'll recall, that Paris was entering their bloody freakout mode over the invasion of the Allied army, who was a suspect, and how everyone inside and out was plotting to hand Paris over to the enemies of the revolution. But it wasn't just Paris that was freaking out. There was a lot of freaking out going on. You'll remember those commissioners, which the Legislative Assembly had kind of sent out into the departments to say, hey, new elections are coming, and the insurrectionary governments, the New World Order of France, they had gone out there and made sure that this was the dawn of a new era, right? But at the same time, they're all out there in the department saying, that whole period where the revolution kind of coddled everybody and said, it's okay if you're a non-juring priest, or, we get that everyone doesn't agree with or doesn't fully vocalize support for everything radical leftist in France. It's okay. People disagree. As long as you're not conspiring against, things actively, we'll probably get along fine. These commissioners were out there going, that's over. There will be no more coddling. And they were saying it over and over to everybody, basically informing everyone in the departments that the people back in Paris here have just decided violently to overthrow the king and the monarchy and the constitution. And anyone who doesn't like that, here comes the hammer. Imagine that being your reality on August 11th. Now you wake up, you read the news that, oh geez, the Swiss Guard were slaughtered and the king is in prison and the government doesn't exist anymore. And then there's a bang on the door at your local, beer hall or whatever, and they're like, you better get with the program or you're next. Decrees start coming out of Paris authorizing the arrest of suspects. And that new extraordinary tribunal that got authorized in August gives everyone a glance at what justice is going to look like in this new era when they really start lopping off heads with the guillotine, not just in Paris, but everywhere. And to add to some of the information from last week's episode, we kind of got into where the idea of the guillotine comes from, but the actual mechanical invention of the guillotine is credited to a surgeon named Antoine Louis, who put the idea that guillotine had down on paper and delivered it to that piano maker as an actual engineering schematic and said, build this. Because Antoine Louis was the guy who actually invented the guillotine, but guillotine is credited with it because he was the guy who stood up in the middle of the National Convention or National Assembly and said, we should have a universal way to execute people by beheading, effectively. And so his name gets slapped on it for all eternity, much to probably his family's chagrin. So these elections to the National Convention unfold. They're not wrong. But these elections to the National Convention unfold under this suffocating blanket of suspicion of who's a suspect and fear of does someone think I'm a suspect? Am I going to be rolled in front of this tribunal, which everyone knew by how the massacres went down, there was no justice in, right? There was no trial. There was no jury. There was no rebuttal and evidence. It was just walk in, you're guilty, you go die. Except now, instead of being walked into a hallway of people with pikes and daggers and being murder stabbed to death, you're being walked up onto the top of a small stage where a blade hangs above you to go zip, thud, and take your head off. But the idea is still the same. This tribunal, which is not going anywhere and will be the major instrument of all of the violence by the guillotine, is very quickly in a month known everywhere as this is how you'll die if not only you're not out there truly or falsely supporting what's going on, but even if you think otherwise, you could be rolled right in front of the tribunal. The elections take place under these conditions. Wondering if their voting record could be a source of worry. That's an interesting statement, and we're going to get into
Remember to
that
clunk that follow button.
People were just scared that something they might say, simply offhand, jokingly, might result in the death penalty. And because of all of this, and no one really went back and looked at their voting histories, but in this election on its own, the turnout for the first ever universal manhood suffrage election in France, the turnout was comically low. And who can blame them? Who can blame an individual for not knowing who is and isn't the right candidate to vote for, and then, as was said, having that vote brought back up and said, wait a second, you voted for an ultra-conservative. You obviously must support them, says the tribunal, and it's over. So I've seen turnout figures for the primary assembly where they elect the elector no higher than 20%. 20%. That's 20% of the eligible men who could vote in France, which is all of them at this point. Everyone is adult who's reached the age of majority. But I've also seen some analysis to show that figure was as low as 5% of eligible voters actually voted for who was in the National Convention. And again, it's understandable, right? Why would you want to show up and vote for the wrong guy or express any doubt about the right guy in the eyes of a revolution where, at this time it could land you in a prison cell and then a tribunal and then the guillotine? So what this meant, though, was that a very specific type of voter showed up to vote. They agreed on a very specific set of principles. And it's ironic that of the three major representative bodies we've covered thus far, the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, and now the National Convention, that the convention, would be by far the most rancorous and faction-ridden of all three. And that's crazy, right? Because go back to the States General and the National Assembly, which was, half third estate bourgeoisie, 1/4 clergy, and 1/4 noble, and they found a way to get along into the National Assembly for the most part, right? They had their differences, but they were compromising in those differences. Except for perhaps Mounier, who didn't get his way, took his ball and went home. But they still worked out their differences in the National Assembly. And then things got worse in the Legislative Assembly, where it was basically all bourgeoisie at that point, right? There's a few priests, almost no nobles, because they didn't exist as a thing anymore legally. And the Legislative Assembly was worse than the National Assembly. And it got taken over by the Girondins, and if you weren't in the war party, generally you were seen to be a traitor unless you were Robespierre or Danton. And it was comprised of a more similar type of person. And now here we are in the National Convention, where it's a very specific worldview that comprises almost everybody who votes for who goes to the National Convention. And within that very tight and narrow scope of what the revolution is about.
No way!
This way, it is the most factionalized and most vicious of all three. And the reason I bring this up is because you can feel the collective understanding from the point of the National Assembly to the Legislative Assembly to the National Convention. What is an allowable perspective constricts into an ever-increasingly cloistered echo chamber, where the only views that are allowed to be spoken are the views we already all agree on. And then instead of finding compromise, we're going to actually seek to kill each other over the littlest of differences that we have. And if that doesn't remind you of how people act today within the social media just vitriol that's out there, it should. Because those people who just cannot conceive to entertain the point of their opposition and reach that middle ground of compromise, they are operating the same way that the individuals who are now going to fight over the smallest of things are going to fight and behave in the National Convention. So the second round of elections were held on September 2nd, the absolute same day that the September massacres got going in Paris. That first prisoner cart got, everyone pulled out of it. And then the prisons got pushed into for the first time. That was the same day that the second round, vote for the actual delegate round of the National Convention's elections were going on. So this obviously didn't affect the vote out in the departments, right? It wasn't going on out in the departments. It was all just cuckoo town in Paris. But it had a major impact on the Paris elections, where you would have to be out of your mind to show up and do anything but vote to the extreme left, because not only was it just dangerous perhaps 2-3 days, it was dangerous that day. Because who knows if there was a band of 20 sans-culottes walking down the street the moment you walked out of putting in your ballot for not the extreme leftist Jacobin candidate. So as a consequence, the Paris delegation would be the most super crazy radical it had ever been across all of the legislative bodies. And you'll remember, even back in the National Assembly, the Paris delegation was late in getting to Versailles, and when they got there, they tilted everything to the left because they were still far further left than all of the provincial delegations at that time. But now they're way left. They're way left of everybody. And it could be very easily summarize that Paris politically is extremely left of where the country is. I'm saying this because just of all the prior groups of individuals who came to work in national legislative government from Paris, and States General and national and legislative assemblies and so on, this group just puts them all in a shadow for how crazy they are as a collective of individuals. There had always kind of been that moderating middle faction, with the Society of 1789 or the remainder of the Feuillants in the prior two bodies. That's not there anymore. That moderating portion of the Paris delegation does not exist in the National Convention. So when the results come in, they read like a who's who of major Paris revolutionaries. Robespierre, Danton, d'Eglantine, Jean-Paul Marat is seated as a delegate. And then Brissot, who's not as radical, right, as the rest of them, still pretty radical, he's still a warmonger, but he was still far too influential at that point in time for him to be denied, and for the rest of the Girondins largely to be denied a seat. You can afford it, says Mads as she yoinks tributes. So, out in the departments, about 200 men, in total, about 200 men who had sat in the Legislative Assembly were re-elected to all their, from their various districts. Let me rephrase this, because I kind of butchered what I want to say here. So if you include the delegation from Paris and the Girondins members of the Paris delegation, who weren't that many, Brissot being one of the few, and then from all of the departments, about 200 men who had previously sat in the Legislative Assembly were re-elected to the National Convention, including all of the prominent Girondins. So Brissot and his Girondin faction is intact as we roll into the National Convention. And then also coming back were about 80 men who had served in the National Assembly. So of that 1,200 or so delegates who made up the National Assembly and then kind of bled themselves a little bit as they started to disagree with everything, about 80 of those guys make their way back around, and they're back in the National Legislature. They didn't know that's what it was going to be yet, but that's what it's going to be. But the most famous of all of those prior people we've talked about from the era of the National Assembly that makes it into the National Convention is the Duc d'Orléans, the Prince of the Blood, cousin of the king, who was now styling himself Philippe Égalité because, noble titles were gone. But I'm going to call him the Duc d'Orléans because it's really going to matter that I call him the Duc d'Orléans down the road. So the Duc d'Orléans gets reelected and gets sent back to represent somebody in the National Convention. And down the road, I'm going to do Philippe Égalité, Egalite. Philippe Égalité is what he styles himself as, because all the nobles, including Lafayette, they changed themselves from being referred to by their title to being referred to by some variation of their name. Like Citizen Gannet is how another noble will refer to himself. We're going to get to that story down the road too. Égalité, yes, that's correct. But just like with Talleyrand tonight, we're going to pull the show over to the side of the road one of these days and do another retrospective on the Duc d'Orléans, the actual cousin of the king here, who is the head of a cadet branch of the Bourbon royal family. Because Orléans, we've talked about this, he was the owner of the Palais Royal, and we had talked about how that was where freedom of the press got kind of started, because it was a royal property and therefore not subject to the severe, censor laws that existed at the time. And so people could set up a printing press on his property and print whatever they wanted and not get in trouble. He kind of fostered some of the early revolutionary momentum that happened. And then he actually did have some parts to play in the National Assembly. Again, too small for us to really focus in on while we were in that moment. I'm going to bet the answer to that is no. Maybe down the road here in a couple of maybe 18 months, he'll feel guilty about it, but probably not then either. But his son is who's really going to matter. We're going to get to all of that. The Duc d'Orléans, his son, who would be the future Duc d'Orléans. And, he's just one of those guys who we, again, like Talleyrand, we've mentioned here and there. We haven't had the opportunity to really say, here is the early life and times of the Duc d'Orléans. Except in this case, it'll be the late life and times of the Duc d'Orléans. But we'll do that again. We're going to kind of do what we do with Talleyrand tonight in a little bit of a shorter version to kind of bring you up to speed on him in one episode here somewhere where I've got some space I need to fill and I can't take the next topic on because it's just too big. But I digress. So of the 749 members of the convention who were seated, about 300 of them were experienced legislators, right? You have the 200 who are coming in from the Legislative Assembly, and then, the 80 or so that had come back over from the National Assembly. So of 749 guys who were being seated, 300 of them had prior experience operating in the menage as part of the legislature. The newcomers were just like as had happened at the Legislative Assembly's start. They had made their name in departmental and local revolutionary politics, and now we're making this jump to the grander stage again. And one of these newcomers had made his name not in the local politics of, Paris, but in international politics. And it was Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense. He was elected to represent the city of Calais. And Paine had just been kicked out of Britain for publishing a defense of the French Revolution called The Rights of Man. And he landed in France just in time to be elected as some kind of honorary delegate by some enthusiastic admirers. Calais, C-A-L-A-I-S. You can Google some of these things. Just right there. French city, Calais. You get it, trust me. Calais will come up if you spell it C-A-L-E-Y, but I'm happy to spell it for you. So Tom Paine, Common Sense, Tom Paine, foundational document of the American Revolution. The people of the common, Variety read this thing Tom Paine had wrote and said, holy crap, we're being oppressed by the British. And it led to a mass unification of the people who would eventually erect trade blockades against the British when the colonies were still the colonies. That Tom Paine was now a delegate to the National Convention in France. So the convention meets for the very first time on September 20th in the Tuileries Palace to have that same sort of, ceremonial credentialing thing that we didn't talk about with the Legislative Assembly and was the critical point of failure for the Estates General. They meet at the Tuileries Palace to have that done on September 20th. And then the very next day, September 21st, they sit down and hold their very first session in the Menage. Okay. Just seeing how much more I had before I would look to take a break here. So from the start, the convention was a very contentious place to be, because two factions walked in the door on the first day ready to obliterate the other one. This is where the self-denying decree probably saved the Legislative Assembly a little bit, because all those cliques that existed in the National Assembly that weren't really all that nasty, they didn't carry over to Legislative Assembly that much. Whereas their Girondins were a thing yesterday, and they're a thing today in the first day. And so are the other Jacobins who don't like the Girondins anymore. Robespierre, his fellow Paris radicals, not Brissot, and about 130 Jacobin-aligned delegates who had come in from the departments, because remember, all those Jacobin clubs are still out there, planted themselves at the top of a set of risers on one side of the hall. So back when we talked about left and right and where that comes from for us modern day politically, these guys kind of did the same sort of thing. They picked out a group of seats together and they sat there, and they were high up at the top of a set of risers all the way on one side of the hall. And this would earn Robespierre and the radical of radical Jacobins the nickname the Montagne, or the Mountain. I'm going to call it the Mountain instead of butchering French, but Robespierre and his faction, because of where they sit, are called the Mountain. Opposed to the Mountain was the Girondins, who number about 200 or so. Now, they tend to vote together and support each other, but you'll remember that there's this ongoing debate in history about how cohesive and organized they were as a group, because they weren't a party, and they weren't a voting bloc, but at this point in time, they're also looking around going, there are enemies everywhere, and they do close ranks and kind of phalanx themselves a little bit politically. So between the 130 delegates of the Mountain and the 200 or so delegates of the Girondins, there is this majority of delegates who fill the seats down near the ground in the Menage, kind of at the bottom of the risers. This unaffiliated majority would become known as the Plain, or the Swamp. It is over this movable group of largely independently voting delegates over which the battles for support in the convention would be waged on. Well, you're tossing a modern day bias at the word the Swamp, for starters. I don't like the Swamp. I mean, there's no reason to pass that bias on to these independent guys who are sitting at the bottom of the Menage. They're not the Mountain, who are the radical driving forward. Swamps suck. I know, I've been in swamps. I've been in plenty of swamps, but the guys that are in the Plain, and I'm probably going to refer to it more as the Plain than the Swamp, because I see it referred to the Plain more often than the Swamp. But they're just kind of caught in the middle, right? They're in the no man's land between the Mountain and the Girondins. And the fights are going to be occurring over, you have to imagine that there's the Mountain on one side and the Girondins on the other side, just basically pulling the arms of these guys, saying, come vote with us, align with us, you need to be with us. The weird thing about these two political cliques, right? The Mountain and the Girondins, where they were generally composed of the same type of man. They were all educated lawyers or professionals that, came thoroughly from the bourgeoisie. There were not, despite what had just happened with the common people rising up, that two-tiered election system did ensure that the delegate who was elected to the National Convention still came from that bourgeois sect. So they were educated lawyers, professionals, doctors. Most had grown up obscure in the departments because they just had risen to prominence alongside the events of the revolution. And they all, or had very recently been, all of them were or had very recently been members of the Jacobin Club. So far, to this point, they only had really disagreed about one thing. Remember, the Jacobin platform had always been active passive citizenship has to go, and then the Girondins kind of diverged from that a little bit. But they had always been about the idea of universal manhood suffrage and pushing the revolution further. These guys were being seated in this thing, all kind of believe that. All of them, regardless of if you're in the Mountain, the Plain, or the Girondins. The only thing that they really disagreed over was the war. Where the Girondins, again, the warmongers, as I tried to cement earlier when we talked about it a few episodes ago, they were extremely pro-war. Brissot had been the driving force of the war last year in 1791, along with all of his Girondin allies and the Girondin ministry. And then Robespierre and now Danton, who is a delegate, they were staunchly anti-war. And the war is the initial wedge issue. But the problem is that the war isn't something they can avoid now. The war is happening. It's not a matter of should we or should we not fight the war. It will be more about how the war is being fought. Because some of these guys were guys that didn't want to fight this war, and they can blame how things go in the war on the people that did want to fight it. But the rest of it really comes down to personality. They just didn't like each other. And that's a really stupid reason to become murderous politically. But they didn't like each other. Danton and Robespierre really didn't like each other, but they hated Brissot. And hate is a strong word, and I mean they hated him. In the same way that people today aren't willing to have a conversation and just simply realize that your political views are not the same as mine, therefore I hate you. That's dangerous. Whereas there are plenty of people who I am friends with who I do not agree with their political views. But we understand that part of them understanding who I am...
Bogus!
Yes, bogus. And me understanding who they are is about a free exchange of ideas, where I need to at least walk in understanding and being open and receptive to why their position is what it is. These guys didn't do that, and we don't do that today. You don't agree with my politics. You are my enemy, and I hate you. What was your last name? It really is like that. It is difficult to resolve differences in personality, but when you root the difference in personality on politics and not who the person is, right? It's a completely different thing. For example, to hear how many people out of legislating in the U.S. I don't understand this sentence. Out of legislating in the U.S. really hate Ted Cruz, even if they were on his side. Yeah, so there are personalities that I do not like in politics either, on all sides. I do not like grandstanders. I have a hard time respecting them when I feel that the job of an elected representative is to, work on behalf of the good of the people. Whatever defines the good of the people is a different thing. But how you go about doing that, whether you view your own cult of personality to be more important than your work, that's a thing for me. Retired. Many people out of legislating. Retired legislators in the U.S. dislike Ted Cruz or hate Ted Cruz. But the key thing is that if you get past... I think people now, because of the way in which our society has evolved, where we have these cults of personality, where people don't really care about what an individual says. Broad brush, don't care about what an individual says. They care about who they appear to be. Whereas if you listen to what one says, you will find you likely have much more in common with individuals who their cult of personality defines them very differently. Yeah, charisma is a political superpower. So the point here is that it does come down to personality. And in the same vein, and we can use a Ted Cruz example. Ted Cruz stands up and says dumb things, and because he's trying to make a splash, and it's a play out of the shock jock playbook, right? Who cares what I said as long as I got everyone's attention? There are individuals like Brissot who have that personality. Brissot is a decent parallel where he was a shock jock. He was trying to get everyone's attention by being fairly outlandish in the things he was saying. And then you have Robespierre, who is very, very measured and calm individual. He's cuckoo inside, right? His brain was scrambled eggs with respect to where things are going to go. But his exterior persona was one that was measured and disciplined. And that was off-putting to people who were not like him. And so instead of understanding where Robespierre or Brissot were coming from, people saw that external facade and were like, I don't like that person. It is like that, where these guys all generally agreed on most things, but those little things became the reason to make one the enemy of the other. And it's really dumb that they did that, and we still do that today, where we don't care much about what someone says or investigate the merit of a statement. We simply don't like how someone presents themselves and label them. And we use that label to define our emotions toward them. Sure, it's human nature, but human nature is also about evolution and self-inspection. Because if you sit there and say, this is how humans are and we never change, then what are we doing? Let's just fold it all up. If we are never going to look in the mirror and say, how can I improve myself so that all is improved much more broadly, then we might as well just fold up the whole human experiment. Because humans don't stop and cement their views at 18 years old or 25 years old. The idea of flip-flopping is stupid. You have to allow that a human, each one of us, will go through a long breadth of experiences in life, refine and sometimes rebut our own premise and change. And changeability is also human nature. So we have to have that to be part of the acceptance of things. And that isn't true today. Remember to clunk that follow button, where being wrong is death to you. And it wasn't true during the French Revolution, where that wasn't allowed. Where the impression of one was formed, and that was all that was needed to make the other the enemy. The other thing that really drove everyone apart here within the National Convention was, of course, power, right? Both groups wanted it. They saw the other group as the obstacle to it as they fought over the plain. Because they had set themselves up, coming in with their robes on for a boxing match before there was even any debate at all on the floor of the National Convention. In the beginning of the convention, though, the Girondins had clearly the edge on power. In many ways, the position of the Girondins is very much the same, or at least similar to that of the Feuillants at the beginning of the Legislative Assembly. The Girondins controlled most of the ministerial posts via the still existing Provisional Executive Council. And their numbers gave them the largest plurality of voters in the Ménage, meaning they had the largest group of coordinated votes. And the new delegates who were coming into Paris that, were of that plain membership, that swamp membership, they initially gravitated over to the Girondins because the Girondins had been the dominant group within the Jacobin Club, which had been sending out all the correspondence, all throughout the early days of 1792. And for the first few months of the convention, the Girondins were able to put their guy into the president's chair of the convention pretty much at will. The same way the Feuillants had been able to control that seat. And the same way that the Monarchians had been able to control that seat. But in a bit of dramatic foreshadowing here, when the delegates all arrived at the Ménage, none of them wanted to sit in the seats that had previously been used by the fallen Feuillants, right? As if they were cursed or something. The Feuillants had been a group that many members of the now convention knew where they had sat, and everyone knew what had happened to the Feuillants. They had faded into nothing. And they thought that those seats were cursed. But as the realities of space and size of the factions wanting to sit together manifested, the Girondins were given little choice and had to sit in the seats that the now absolutely annihilated Feuillants had sat in previously. Dun, dun, dun. The big thing, though, that gave the Girondins their immediate gravitational claim over new members was the reaction to the September massacres. Yeah, the seats are cursed, you're cursed, everything's cursed. I mean, they might be, because the Girondins, they don't get the good end of the result here down the road either. But the new plain, swamp, unaffiliated delegate came in, and they were off-put by the mountain, because who was in the mountain, right? Jean-Paul Marat. First and foremost, Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre. Most of the departmental delegates were horrified by what had happened during the September massacres. If you include the body count from August 10th through the massacres, more than 2,000 enemies of the revolution had been slaughtered by armed mobs in less than 6 weeks. And I know we didn't connect that before, but think about that. From August 10th through basically September 9th, 2,000 people get murdered in the name of the revolution for not thinking or saying or doing, or just happened to be arrested at the wrong time. Apart from the human suffering, most of the delegates who were coming in were lawyers, right? And they were just appalled by the lack of the rule of law that had gone down over the last 2 months. And then right away, the delegation from Paris comes under fire for their role in the massacres. It was well understood that Danton and Robespierre and their gang were tied to that insurrectionary commune, which had been the catalyst and the engine driving everything that went down on the 10th. And in a very real sense, that Robespierre and Danton and other people affiliated with them were the representatives of the insurrectionary commune in the National Convention. So they looked over there at the mountain and said, those guys are basically the delegation from the insurrectionary commune. Those guys are the ones that slaughtered all these people, or someone within it. And so they went and gravitated toward the Girondins. The very first pointed rebuke of the insurrectionary commune and those members of it, which now sat in the mountain, was the election of the first president of the convention, which was Jérôme Pétion. If you'll remember, Jérôme Pétion was that second mayor of Paris who just was pretty much told not to show up for work on the 10th because he had already been fired, and they tried to reinstate him, but his government was ousted. His Paris city government was ousted on the 10th of August. And the very first president of the National Convention is Jérôme Pétion, representative of that prior to the insurrectionary commune Paris government. What faction was Pétion part of in the convention? He was not a part of the mountain. He kind of leaned toward the Girondins, but if you need to smack a label on him, he was a part of the plain. Because he was not a Girondin. He worked with the Girondins, and a lot of people were kind of like this, where are you or are you not a member of the Girondins? Because they're not a group. They don't have a meeting club. They don't have their own newsletters. They don't organize as a voting bloc, right? They were a sub-faction of the Jacobins. And the Jacobins are the ones with the clubhouse. Yeah, no problem. And I get it, man. It's a good question. Because we can say definitively, the one Girondin that really matters, or the two Girondins that really matter who have any power at this point, are Brissot and Roland, right? Where you have the rest of the mountain, Danton and d'Eglantine, Robespierre and Jean-Paul Marat, they're all over there. You can firmly put the stamp mountain on those guys. But Pétion is one of those guys who's just like, is he? Was he? I don't know. Because did he always have coffee with and talk with those guys afterward and hang out in Madame Roland's salon? No. Did he more ally with them because they were the guys who backed him more? Yes. Does that make him a Girondin? I don't know. You know,
No
yes
way.
way. And it is a great question because you don't know. Because the Girondins were not a club that had dues, that had a membership role, right? You just don't know. I think that's kind of the point I try to make about the Girondins every time I get the opportunity to do so, is they are not the same type of thing as the Jacobins. They just slotted themselves in there. But now, because there is a need to define factionalization within the convention, they are a faction. They probably didn't want to be a faction rolling in here because they had a lot of bad decisions rolling up to this kind of slapped on them by people like Brissot, but it is what it is, and the Girondins see the Mountain as the problem. The Mountain sees the Girondins as the problem, and they both want to destroy each other to get to power at this point. But Pétion was more... He was seated as the president by the Girondins, who had more sway over the plain, as a boop, poke in the eye to the members of the Mountain, who were part of the insurrectionary commune government. And that's really the major point here. But the first order of business of the National Convention did manage to bring everyone together. On September 21st, the very first day of the National Convention, there was a unanimous vote to abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. A republic, just like the United States is supposed to be, where you have representative bodies and a constitutional executive, and except none of the documents to make that happen existed. This was just about the very last thing that the convention would, agree on. That a new kingless constitution now had to be drafted. They kind of walked in the door knowing that was going to be true because there's the king, he's in jail, and the Constitution of 1791 is bye-bye. So what else did they think they were going to do when they walked in the door? But they made it official, and they all got together and sang Kumbaya and held hands, not really. And this was the one thing that passed unanimously, the only thing that passed unanimously within the National Convention. Once it was settled that the monarchy was abolished, the question became, what's going to happen to the king? And that's when the unanimity and cohesion of everybody that had just been there when they abolished the monarchy collapsed. Talk about that a little bit when we get back. We'll get into some of the other things that went down apart from matters about the king. And then we'll get into the early life and times of our friend Talleyrand, and you'll get a better perspective on who he is. But I went a little bit over, and that's fine. We've been going for just over an hour. We're going to take our first break. Again, we come back. We're going to talk about what to do with the king, broke down the convention, and we'll pick it up from there. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for being here tonight. Again, thanks to the resubs, and man, you guys knocked it out of the park. We raised $1,000 in a week for Stop Soldier Suicide, so I'm going to see if we can raise another $1,000 by October 31st, but again, that's a stretch goal, and we'll see if we get there. I'll be right back. Get up, walk around. Don't forget to muster. You're going to lose 1,000 tributes, and we'll talk to you in just a few minutes.
Gentlemen, we're history.
So let's get this one out of the way. Manny, stop that. Don't be, I don't want to interrupt him when he's talking. Say hi. I'd like to know who's here. That's why you guys have that whole welcome thing, so I know my friends are here. Say hello. Please stop sitting on your hands and not speaking because you feel it's interrupting me. I, as has been demonstrated across the course of all of this, can roll with it. So say hi. If you're Manny or someone else that's not saying hi and you usually want to talk during what we're talking about so you can participate in chat, do it. I don't care. I would prefer that you do it. Personal choice, whatever. Is that why you've been rolling in here and trying to get first done when you know my bot's up? I can turn it off for you if you want, man. You want your welcome thing going? I'll turn it off. That way you can talk. Anyway. Well, before we took our break, we were talking about... Let me fix my hair because it just came out of my hat a little bit. We were talking about how the National Assembly had unanimously decided to abolish the monarchy, and that was the very last thing they unanimously decided upon. That the very next thing, okay, there's no monarchy anymore, we've got the king sitting in the temple, what do we do with him? That was the thing that broke everything down, because some members of the convention wanted to put him on trial for treason. Others said that August the 10th had been the trial, that it was a public trial, and he was obviously found guilty. And others legally said that a king could not be put on trial, and according to the Constitution of 1791, that was true. The king, if convicted, if impeached, which was the only thing they could do to him, the only thing that could happen to him was he was basically removed. He lost his power. He was booted from office. And that had already happened. So there was this big debate about what to do with Louis XVI and his future. Some people wanted him dead. Other people wanted him in prison forever. And some people kind of secretly wanted him back on the throne but couldn't say so because the tribunals out there starting to lop off heads. The future of the king and his life will be the dominant focus of the first few months of the convention. It's a twisting and winding story that will actually take us into 1793. And I'm going to talk tonight about absolutely none of it. Louis's trial will be what we talk about next week. It is that complex and the rolling tide of events that major that it really needs to just be its own episode. If only his nose wasn't so well known. Yeah, that's a great point, right? What would have happened if at the during the flight only so far as Varennes, one person didn't look at a piece of money and go, that nose looks just like the king. Completely different ending of history for one guy who basically worked as a postman to just figure that out. So as that portion of the story is being set aside tonight, and believe me, it'll be much better given its own treatment, its own thing. You'll enjoy it far more. We're gonna instead focus on how the Mountain and the Girondins simply went at each other over other matters which occupied their time during the same period. So we're gonna talk about everything but the trial tonight. And then next week we're going to rewind back to this point in history, and we're going to tell the story of King Louis. So this is where your marker is for when that conversation begins next week. So the Girondins moved quickly to try to destroy the Mountain before everyone had really even gotten settled in the convention. In the first week of the operation, please make the rewind noise again. That one? Is that the rewind noise you wanted because you're going to clip it? There it is. Will we see the rewind silver bars? No, that would be great though. I need to turn that one off too. I've been trying to find and kill all those balloons. So let me pull the chat balloon from the clip command. There we go. I spelled balloon wrong, but whatever. I don't know what I meant. Thank you for trying, though, Gilly. So in the first week of the convention, where everyone was still kind of getting their bearings who wasn't part of the Legislative Assembly, the Girondins began to openly accuse Robespierre of masterminding the September massacres, basically so that he could kill all of his enemies and set himself up as a dictator. That was their balloon. That was their political theory that they pushed forward in the I'm just asking questions kind of way. Their main tactic here was to link Robespierre to Jean-Paul Marat, right? Because everyone knew Marat had been the main instigator of the massacres, both from his printing press and his position on the Committee of Surveillance. Marat had also been calling for a military dictatorship in his Friend of the People in the midst of all of his other howling to purge France of the impure. The Girondins then pivoted from this to a personal attack on Robespierre, or from this personal attack on Robespierre, to an attack on the Paris Insurrectionary Commune, who they argued posed a threat to the convention. So here's the Girondins, with the mountain on the other side, pointing at the Paris Insurrectionary Commune government, who is, maybe, they said before this thing got started as a convention, might not be legal. They're now pointing at it and saying, it's actually a threat to us, this body, this convention. That insurrectionary commune government, which was not elected, is a threat to the legislature. Anytime something within, and they argued, the Girondins argued this, anytime something within the convention did not go the insurrectionary commune's way, they could simply press a button and unleash hordes of sans-culottes on all of them in the convention. And that's actually true, because they all just saw it happen to the Legislative Assembly, right? To counter this threat, the Girondins proposed calling in National Guard units from the departments to act as defenders of the convention, which kind of ignores the fact that the last time, a couple months ago, when the National Guard came into Paris, they simply allied themselves with the insurrectionary commune. So I'm not sure how wise that proposal was. Rocket, thank you for the resub. But that's what they're proposing as the preventative measure to keep the insurrectionary commune. Resub from Psy as well. 16 months at tier 3 for Psy. 16 months at tier 1 for Rocket. Thank you both very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So the Girondins are out here saying the insurrectionary commune is a threat not to France, but to this body's business. And what we should do is bring in the National Guard to basically be the perimeter defense of the menage to make sure we can get our business done. Ignoring the fact that the last time the National Guard came in, they turned Federer and back to the insurrectionary commune, and it was the major reason the August 10th insurrection worked. But this initial attack from the Girondins, lost all of its steam when Marat stood as a delegate, because that's the reality. Jean-Paul Marat is a delegate of the National Convention, stood up and declared that in all of his actions where he espoused the need for a dictatorship, that it was his own doing, that Robespierre had never been involved with it. And so the argument about it was lost. And then there was the perplexed reaction to all of this barking from the Girondins going at the mountain, wondering why they were attacking Robespierre and the insurrectionary commune. They saw it as odd. It was a weird thing to fixate on, because there were plenty of other bigger problems facing France at the moment, right? We don't have a legitimate government in place. Yeah, Brunswick and the Allied army retreated, but how long are they going to be gone for? We're supposed to be here to write a constitution. Why is your first order of business to attack Robespierre? And so that initial gravity that they had over that plain, the Girondins held that sway over the plain due to the massacres, it starts to ebb. Like, oh, how reasonable are those guys? I mean, yeah, the massacres were crazy and Marat's a Looney Tunes guy, but we're stuck in the middle and going, Well, who? What? What? They just get confused by it. Why is that the Girondin focus? But the Girondins weren't deterred. And Robespierre was not their only enemy. And they soon set their sights on Georges Danton, whom many, especially Madame Roland, who was puppeteering from the shadows like she did so effectively throughout this entire period, the Girondins largely thought that Danton was also behind the massacres, even though we know, with the hindsight of history, that Danton's greatest sin in the massacres was basically the conscious decision to do nothing about it. He saw it as well, we need the ends, and I guess this is the means. That was Danton's philosophy. But the Girondins thought that he had been intimately involved with the planning and execution of it. And Danton's position within the convention in its early days was a bit odd, as he was, still the sitting Minister of Justice in the Provisional Council. Having that sort of joint role was something that had previously been forbidden by both of the two prior sitting legislative bodies. Are their debt problems even considered solved at this point? They're way better than they were in 1788, let's say it that way, because of all the use of church property, right? But are they on firm financial footing? No. Are they better than they were? Yes. We're actually going to talk about that when we get to Talleyrand tonight. I think we can get further on that point, because Talleyrand led the charge so heavily on the use of church lands. But again, Danton was sitting as a delegate of the Mountain in the convention, but was also the Minister of Justice, right? And that had been a no-no in the prior two legislative bodies. Danton sat with the Mountain, but he very much wanted to retain his independence. And he actually worked behind the scenes here to try to mend the rift between the Mountain and the Girondins. Because he saw that they had, and he was such a forward-looking guy. Remember, he looked forward immediately after the insurrection. He was always looking to what was next, not what had just happened. But he saw that these two factions had so much in common and so very little that truly divided them apart from personality that it seemed silly to him that they should be in some sort of political war state after what had just been achieved, right? We got what we wanted. We got the king out of here, and we're writing a Republican Constitution. Why are we at each other's throats? And he was actually one of those backdoor behind the scenes trying to make compromises guys. He saw it as insanity to potentially derail the convention and the new constitution simply for the sake of indulging these personal grudges and personality and past grievances. He actually was rising above all of that as opposed to most people. So to counter the notion that he was aiming for a personal dictatorship, or he was, really involved with what had all just gone down in September, in his maiden speech, Georges Danton, to the convention, he states he will resign from his post as Minister of Justice. He says, okay, we got where we were supposed to get, and now we've got this body that's going to write a new constitution. I'm just one of many voices. And he gives up power, which doesn't happen very often in history, that a person in power gives it up. Now, he doesn't give it all up, right? He's still involved, and he's going to be a very influential guy, but he goes from being super, super influential to kind of more influential than the average delegate. That promise that he made in that speech was kept. 2 weeks after he made it, when Danton was sure that the French victory at Valmy, which we talked about last week, had in fact turned the army around. He might not have had, he had not this target on his back. He does have a target on his back, but it's from just the Girondins right now. That'll change. But Danton's resignation from ministry was not enough for Madame Roland, Brissot, and her mouthpieces in the Girondins. And in mid-October 1792, the Girondins start to go after Danton regarding, guess what? His super sloppy bookkeeping during his former position, his time in his former position of Minister of Justice. And I said last week, don't forget about that. that Danton, not really keeping track very well of where he spent the money, was going to come back to bite him. This is the first time. What date was that? Just October. Just October. The date of the speech, I didn't give it. And it doesn't matter. I know you're trying to pump up for the quiz, but I didn't give those dates. Yeah, that's really what's going on. Not really you lost 550,000 livres, but where did you spend 550,000 livres? Danton had spent that money, a lot of money, in such a short period of time, and no one really had much of an idea where it had gone, though it was clear at least a substantial portion of it had been paid out to arm the Paris sections, which really didn't seem like the business of the Minister of Justice, right? Part of what Danton did was pay out to arm the sans-culottes, arm them better. It comes in kegs? While the vast majority of the money was publicly unaccounted for, Danton plausibly in this instance makes the case that he had spent the money in the way that he had thought best to defend Paris, which was, at the time of his spending of it, under legitimate threat from an allied army. And he could say, I spent this money to arm the sans-culottes because what if we actually had to defend the city and the army wasn't here? And that actually logically makes a whole lot of sense. He also argued that he had shown his receipts to his colleagues in the Provisional Executive Council, which you will recall were those restored Girondin ministers who were right now attacking him. And they had approved his work. And those Girondin ministers who were still on the Provisional Executive Council came forward and said, yeah, he did that. He told us what he was spending it on. And while there's no paper trail, they all said, yep, that's what happened. And the Girondins, who were not delegates, backed Danton against the Girondins who were delegates. And you can see right there how they were not a coordinated political faction, because that would have never happened. You'll also recall in the days right after August 10th, Danton dominated that council, right? That group who had just stood up and said, that's what happened. He dominated that group. So it's really, who knows? Who knows what was going on? Did he have them in their back pocket, in his back pocket, due to blackmail? For whatever reason, they all stood up and backed him. Did I say that he also financed a network of spies? Yes, he did that as well. But all these attacks from the Girondins culminated at the end of October and the beginning of November, when the Girondins actually attempted to expel the entire Paris delegation from the convention as a threat to the convention. On October 25th, the Girondins sent one of their more minor members to reopen the case against Robespierre on the floor of the convention again. And the model of this speech was based on Cicero from Rome, and anyone that's familiar with that, it's based on a speech Cicero gave called the Catalan Orations, where it was, again, oratory designed to foster animosity towards a potential tyrant. Where, in this speech, Robespierre was again accused of trying to set himself up as a dictator, even though that argument had largely been undercut already by Marat. But Robespierre comes back to the floor a week later, and with his defense, he absolutely wins over the plain. That group of not Girondins, not mountain delegates, who is really where the power was. Robespierre entirely dismissed the premise of this Girondin attack as both stupid and petty, and in some regards he was very right. He laughed at the notion of him, of all people, being anything but an instrument of virtue. And you will remember that that is the impression that Robespierre cultivated publicly, that he was a man of virtue. Roman virtue really drove him.
Shame! Shame!
Shame, Gilly.
Shame!
You got caught
Shame!
trying to steal from a friend. Shame! But Robespierre he's the man of virtue, the weird man of virtue who didn't drink wine but drank milk. He said, how stupid is this argument that they're making? They're telling you that I want to be a dictator when all I am is a man of virtue. He then laid out in his speech And this is really, really telling of where things are. While he's defending himself, he lays out what will become the official revolutionary position on the September massacres. Robespierre makes an inextricable link from the massacres to the insurrection of August the 10th, that they were both driven by the same historical force. To deny that one was okay was then in turn to deny the other was okay. And of course, no one wants to turn back the clock on August the 10th, right? Because that is what the will of the people was. So in turn, if the massacres were an end result of that action, which we all wanted, we must accept that the massacres also had to happen. Because they were driven by the same virtuous impulses that led to the insurrection. It had been illegal, of course, but it had also been the will of the people, and that's what matters. Do you want to have a revolution without a revolution? He asked famously, and it was very shrewd, as Gilly said. He's justifying the ends, or an end, because one of the means was what they actually wanted. An end in the insurrection became a means to an end of the massacres, and the first end was a desired state, which had no choice but to lead to this other end, because they were motivated by the same thing. And if we want to love the one, we must at least accept the other as inevitably a consequence of it. It's crazy when you think about it, right? I mean, it really would have only taken someone in the beginning of September to say, whoa, 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 whoa. We have a justice system, and these people deserve trials, and this is crazy. But in the heat of, holy crap, here comes the Allied army, and there had just been a major internal uprising of the people in Paris. Yeah, his argument is extremely flawed, but very well constructed within the Enlightenment logic of the time, and it's convincing to people who listen to it, because Robespierre was a very gifted speaker. All of this, though, was a sideshow.
No way!
Yes, way. All of this stuff we just talked about with the Girondins going after Robespierre, and Robespierre standing up and rebutting them, and kind of winning the hand, right? He wins this hand. Robespierre and the Mountain, at the end of the day, win the argument, because they cement down what is, again, that official revolutionary perspective of the massacres, and kind of why they happened and why it had to be okay. You know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But they win the argument that we didn't have a hand in it. It was the natural evolution of events, and everyone kind of goes, huh, okay, and they go along with it. But it was still all a sideshow. Because over this period of time that I've been talking, the other thing has been going on. The whole, what are we going to do about the king? And committees had been forming, and evidence which the Legislative Assembly had collected from the Tuileries Palace had been passed along for inspection to the National Convention, and that had been going over. Delegates had been reading through what Louis had been writing. And next week we'll go into all of that. We'll delve into those committees and their recommendations on how the trial of Louis XVI should actually legally be conducted, and the outcome of that trial, and how that manifested in its repercussions across France. That will be everything we talk about next week. It's, you know, we're an hour and a half into this episode, and that is easily 2 hours of conversation, just talking about the lead up to the trial and the trial itself, and then what happens after the trial, which would have made it impossible for me to talk about tonight, because it would have been 10 o'clock Eastern time before we got done, which is why we're going to put the pause button on the National Convention. That's where we're going to leave them, and again, we'll go and bring it back to that other point that we talked about right at the beginning of September, or right at the end of September, September 21st, when they can, you know, actually start debating in the Menage. We'll rewind back to that, and actually probably talk about a little bit of the stuff that happened in August to go through Louis' trial next week. But we are instead, for the rest of tonight, going to talk about one guy. Our good buddy. This guy right here. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. And I'll raise that up so that banner's not covering his name up. That guy right there. We've mentioned him here and there. Yeah, it's a portrait more contemporary to his age at the time that he departs Paris in 1792. But last week we spent a lot of time talking about our good friend Lafayette. And Lafayette's a good guy, right? He's got generally good intentions at heart. I think a lot of people listen to like the future of Lafayette as he goes to an Austrian prison and like, man, he got done dirty. And Gilly said so, Dustin said so, and he did. He's a guy that largely fought for the same things in the United States and then came back to France pretty much the same guy and fought for the same things. And you have Americans who love him. And as was said, he leaves Paris and France with enemies everywhere around him because they all universally reviled him. You know, most people didn't like him, but he was the same guy. But we're going to say goodbye for now. Oh, he's absolutely a smug snob. Talleyrand is absolutely a smug snob, but he's one of my, and this is, I don't say this lightly. I have read a lot of history. I love history, and I spend a lot of time just reading it for fun and watching it for fun and investigating it for fun. He is easily one of my top 5 favorite historical figures. Not because Talleyrand's a good guy. He's not a good guy. He is just an interesting guy. Julius Caesar wasn't a good guy either. He was an extremely interesting guy. But we're going to say goodbye to him because he did depart Paris last week. He is someone you're not as familiar with, but who will be just as, if not more consequential to the future of France than Lafayette. He will absolutely be more consequential to France during Napoleon's rise to power. It's kind of only fitting that we give the guy some sort of summary to the man that history knows as Talleyrand, so that when he comes back to the stage, you'll have a much better understanding of him and his motivations, and he will come back to the stage faster than Lafayette does. Talleyrand as an individual can be summed up by many, many words. He is one of those great men of history. For those that believe that in the philosophy that history is dictated by the few great influential individuals rather than the evolving tide of the greater human population. I personally believe it's an amalgam of those two things. I believe that great individuals can have a major impact on that tide. It is how the tide of the human population reacts to those great individuals that dictates the future state of the people. I don't believe they're mutually exclusive. A lot of people who enjoy historiography will tell you it's one or the other. I believe it's both. I believe they both intersect. But some of those words which can be used to describe Talleyrand are brilliant, duplicitous, far-sighted, amoral, treasonous, brutally cold-hearted, seductively charming, passionate, womanizing, excommunicated ex-bishop, and greatest diplomat of all time. Up until the September massacres, he has been around for everything that we've talked about in the French Revolution, basically from Calonne forward. But I've only really been able to sneak him in sideways with mentions of his conduct here and there, when his influence has been far more impactful. Such is the way of a man who worked not really at the front leading edge of events, but from a step behind, manipulating currents instead of riding on the edge of them. There have been other individuals who are simply more central to our story and standing in the spotlight, which has made it hard to focus on Talleyrand, even though I've made an effort to try to just remind you he exists here and there. He's renowned for his amoral double-dealing and diplomatic prowess, and in this last section of today's episode, I'm going to remedy this whole thing where we really haven't given you that whole background by talking about him for a while. So here is the early life and times up to the point where he leaves Paris in 1792 of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, or who we know colloquially as Talleyrand. He was born in Paris in 1754 into an old noble family who held a position at court in Versailles. This makes him about 38 years old at the time he left Paris in the fall of 1792. He was the oldest child of a younger son. So he was the older child of a younger son within that noble family. So his parents were not particularly that rich or prominent. His father was an army officer who was constantly on assignment, and Talleyrand would actually remark later in life that he essentially was raised as an orphan. And he said he really had never spent more than a week total in his life under the same roof as his parents. He never slept under the same roof as his parents. And that actually wasn't that uncommon for the children of nobles who actually lived at Versailles. Veterans, yeah, can we ban that one, please? Or I'll ban them. There it goes again, everybody. Welcome to the fact that there is a group of individuals out there on Twitch who think that sort of thing is absolutely hilarious. So you can take your follow, you won't be able to talk, and we'll just ban you outright. Have a nice day. Go find someone else. But it wasn't uncommon for nobles who lived at Versailles, and that is what had happened since Louis XIV. They actually lived in the 400 plus apartments of Versailles, and their kids weren't there. They lived elsewhere because Versailles was not a place for kids. Yeah, I got it. It's taken care of. So Talleyrand commented that he never really spent any time with his parents, and that was true. And that, again, it wasn't unheard of either. But when he was a toddler, Talleyrand developed a debilitating and permanent limp in one leg, which was either a birth defect or the result of some kind of accident, which isn't documented. But the latter, that he just had an accident as a kid, was Talleyrand's own explanation for the fact that he constantly limped. But this limp precluded the military career that his father had planned for him. Remember, his father was a soldier and had hoped that Talleyrand, his eldest son, would follow in his footsteps. But the limp said, nah, you can't be a soldier if you're going to limp around everywhere. So instead, Talleyrand was pointed to a career in the church. Remember, he's an aristocrat in his youth. He's a noble in his youth. Given that a priest could not serve as the proper head of a family, especially a noble family, in his role, I'm the oldest son, he was actually stripped by his family of his inheritance rights because he's going to go be a priest and not have a family. So Talleyrand's younger brother became the inheritor of the estate. So the disinherited Talleyrand was shipped off to boarding school, and a few years later he was shipped off to a seminary. And though Talleyrand was something of an embarrassment to his family due to the limp and the curtailed before it ever happened military career, his parents still kind of had high hopes for him. His uncle was the Archbishop of Reims, and don't ask me to say that in French because I can't, because my mouth doesn't make that sound. And the plan was for Talleyrand to simply come through the ranks of being an aristocratic member of the clergy, which meant he wasn't a common priest, and eventually succeed his uncle in that position, which would bring in a huge salary, right? Because those bishops back then were paid way more money than the priests were. And he would also get church lands under that whole system within the Ancien regime, which would enrich his relatively impoverished junior branch of his family's noble family. But when Talleyrand arrived at seminary, he discovered he did not much like the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church did not much like him either. See, Talleyrand was a free thinker and a bibliophile. He read voraciously. And he took one look at the superstitious dogmatism, his words, of Catholicism, and decided personally that it was all a bunch of laughable nonsense. Again, his perspective. He looked at Catholicism and was like, none of this is real. And then Talleyrand, blossomed into his teenage years and did what teenagers do. He liked to have a good time and he liked to stay up late. And then he discovered girls, which was not too much in keeping with what his church education was telling him he should care about. At the age of 21, Talleyrand was freed from the confines of the seminary and was sent to finish his studies at the Sorbonne in Paris. There, in Paris, at 21, he either blossomed further or rotted further, depending on one's perspective. He embraced the freedoms and delights of Paris. He made fast friends with other carefree young liberal nobles, and then added the last piece to his really disreputable puzzle when he discovered cards. And he became instantly a fairly obsessive shark at playing cards. And in many ways here, Talleyrand is an example of everything pious Catholics were complaining about in those cahiers in the waning days of the Ancien regime, right? He was a gambling young noble who loved to drink wine all night, but somehow was involved with the church. He loved cavorting with mistresses. He made an absolute open secret of the fact that he was an atheist, even though he was a member of the clergy, or about to be. And not only did he not get kicked out of the church for that, but he was rapidly promoted due to his family's connections in court at Versailles. He was given positions within the church, and he enjoyed salaries they provided before he was ever even ordained. Yeah, exactly. We're going to get to that. No wonder he told Lafayette not to make him laugh when he was giving mass. He had to find the whole thing laughable. Or he was afraid he didn't know how to do a mass. But when he was finally ordained, at the age of 25, even though he was openly atheist, Talleyrand was appointed an agent general of the church, which was traditionally a broad but vaguely defined, cushy job with very little responsibility and a fat salary, typically the job that goes to the young sons of nobles, in the church at that time. But it was in this role of agent general that he further flourished. Because despite all the stuff that we've kind of listed here is pretty negative, Talleyrand was not, in fact, some really shiftless, good-for-nothing leech on society. He was bursting with energy. He was full of ideas. He had a passion for hard, intellectually stimulating work. And as agent general, he found himself overseeing church property, and instead of just sitting back and collecting taxes or whatever the revenue stream was from those properties, he found more efficient and profitable uses for those properties, both for himself, of course, because Talleyrand always does one thing, and that's take care of number one, but also for the church. He also undertook a huge...
Remember to clonk that follow button.
A huge inspection of northwest France, which led him to write an exceedingly impressive report that recommended a huge list of practical reforms, though not all of them were embraced. One such reform, which Talleyrand wrote about, and this will be the last thing I talk about before the break, and we come back to the second half, really, of what we're talking about with him here. But one of those reforms that Talleyrand brought back from that Northwest inspection tour, that would be the Northwest Coast inspection tour, was he saw the wives, these fishmonger wives, who had lost husbands at sea, stuck in a land of limbo, right? Because if the death of someone could not be confirmed, they could not remarry. And Talleyrand came back in his very analytical way and said, look at what makes sense here. These women, their husbands are dead, right? We just can't prove it. Why don't we cut them the benefit of the doubt after a couple of years when their husbands don't come back? They're not going to tread water out there forever. And they should just be freed from their marriages and allowed to go about their lives. And the reaction from the Catholic Church to this suggestion was, how dare you sully this, the absolutely sanctified bonds of marriage? And that's where Talleyrand's enlightened pragmatism conflicted with the church, because the church, regardless of if the church agreed with him or individuals who heard what he said agreed with him and said, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Maybe be better for them too. They shouldn't be out there suffering without the ability to remarry. They sat back and did what they did all the time. They group-thunk dogmatism and said, we must give the public impression that the dogma is what matters, and they rebutted his attempt to have that happen. And that was actually something that Talleyrand had no personal interest in, right? How was Talleyrand going to benefit from allowing fishmonger wives of deceased husbands at sea to remarry. He wasn't going to get a cut of the check for the marriage license. It legitimately was something he sincerely thought was good. And he got flicked in the ear for saying it out loud. So we're going to take our second break here. And I know it's a little bit quicker, but we went over in the first one. But when we come back, we're going to pivot from this whole early part of his life to the part that you're going to start to recognize when his relationship with Controller General Calonne in 1787 starts his march into the revolution. And then we're going to cover where he was at every key point through everything we've talked about so far, leading up to him walking into Danton's office and saying, "Hey, can I get out of here?" And then we'll wrap it up and go to the quiz. So thanks for hanging out, as always, everybody. We raised $1,000 for Stop Soldier Suicide in a month. We appreciate your love and attention and time tonight. I hope you're enjoying this and this closer look at Talleyrand, who we really haven't had a chance to talk about like this, and I find fascinating as an individual. We'll be right back. Make sure you stand up, walk around, get a drink, all that stuff. In a few more minutes, we'll come back. We'll pick up with basically the assembly of notables and take you through the French Revolution from the perspective of Talleyrand, and then we'll get to the quiz. Thanks for being here. I'll be back in a few minutes. It was a week.
Gentlemen, we're history.
So while we're coming back, don't forget that BRB music was made by our good friend CF Live. Click that link in chat and go give him a follow, as well as Max, who I know watches history. He is the lead noodler on that one, and give him a follow as well, even though he doesn't stream as often as he used to because he's on baby duty most of the time now. But Max has been participating more with the Outlaws community with what we do in Destiny. Yeah, that guy actually has an underscore at the end, so not that one, but it's CF Live underscore at the end. But actually, there's a link up there as well. But CF and Max produced that music for us. You hear it every break. It really isn't easy for them to put together the custom stuff for us, and I really do appreciate it. That's CF Live. That one is the one you want to go see. So before we continue with the Life and Times of Talleyrand, do you guys enjoy this sort of biography? Because there have been people where I've been able to like squeeze in a biography, like Danton got one in the middle of it because I was able to just weave it into the narrative because it's so important in that moment. And there's other people like the Duc d'Orléans who I will do this for because I have to. But there are opportunities for me to talk about other people where maybe they don't influence things so directly, but their stories are interesting. And where I am kind of in this situation I was this week where I was kind of stuck. I was like, what do? I can talk this far, but I have to stop there, and I've got an easy 40 minutes to an hour and a half that I gotta fill. If you like these, I don't know exactly how you have done it differently other than to completely front-load the narrative with biographies, which is harder to follow. Danton's the best example. I think I biographied him very seamlessly into the narrative without you really noticing I was doing it. I kind of talked about him. I did it with Brissot a little bit as well. Lafayette, as I've done that too, but this is the first time I've outright said, stop. All we're going to do is talk about this guy for an hour. I think there's merit to doing it the way I was doing it, but there's also those times where there's no way I could have done Talleyrand in the same way I did Danton. There's just no way. He's not as consequential early as Danton is, but he is impactful, as you're about to see. So you do think it's better to separate them as I've done here. For certain people, I think I will. Napoleon, I certainly will. I think Napoleon's early days are going to get their own episode when we get to that point. Because he is out there doing stuff, and I am going to mention him here and there in the same way I've mentioned Talleyrand, but when he actually steps foot forward before he actually becomes the leading, war pusher in France prior to ever becoming emperor, I think it's I think we'll have to do the same thing. So it's good to know that this is well received and not like, I don't want to hear about one guy for an hour fix. But we'll come back to this conversation. So he got ordained. He did that inspection tour of Northwest France. He came back with those recommendations. And the thing here to remember is this hard-working reformist Talleyrand, who was operating as agent general of the church, still wasn't going to stand in the way an entertaining man-about-town Talleyrand. Through the 1780s, Talleyrand still made a name for himself in the Paris salons as, for many fine and some not so fine reasons. He was acknowledged without a doubt one of the finest conversationalists of the day and an intellectual force to be reckoned with. And conversation was one of the primary ways in which the aristocracy entertained each other, was getting into these conversations that may just be entirely theoretical, but were a test of, mental fortitude and logical capability, and Talleyrand was one of the best at it. But he was also recognized as one of the most amoral men in Paris, who didn't really seem to care about that or all of the scandals he left in his wake. But despite his immorality, he did expect to not only be ordained as he'd just been, but be appointed to a high ecclesiastic office. And while he was waiting for that appointment, which he would get, he struck up a mutually admiring rapport with the then Controller General Calonne, who you guys should remember from way back. And in February 1787, Calonne did invite Talleyrand to join that working group that was patching together that reform package, which would then be presented to the Assembly of Notables. Remember, Calonne and Vergennes both got sick that winter, but when Talleyrand showed up to take this assignment within this group, he was shocked at how disorganized and last minute Calonne's preparation seemed to be. Which, again, if you recall, that really stemmed from Calonne's illness and the sudden death of Vergennes, the foreign minister, prior winter. Plus, Calonne was arrogant. He had that arrogant assumption that the notables would just pretty much rubber stamp whatever was put in front of them because they had been picked to do that. But you will also recall that the Assembly of Notables absolutely shared Talleyrand's view of the haphazard organization of the package, and they used that as the excuse to go through it line by line and object to most of it. But as the Notables gave way to the Estates General, Talleyrand naturally gravitated to Adrien Dupour's Society of 30, which is where most of the liberal nobles of the day landed, like Lafayette. But at the same time, Talleyrand then found himself appointed to that high ecclesiastic office when King Louis XVI made him the Bishop of Autun, mostly as a favor to Talleyrand's dying father in 1788. Now, Talleyrand had never been to Autun in his life, and he would only put his boots down there once as their bishop when he went there to ask for their vote as a First Estate delegate to the Estates General in 1789 in April. But he also quickly ducked out of Autun after he secured that election so that he didn't have to deliver an Easter Mass, which he probably didn't know how to do properly anyway. He strolled into Autun talking the clerical talk to a group of strangers and then got elected, which speaks volumes to his ability to talk people into just about anything. In the early days of the Estates General, Talleyrand was in the liberal noble minority of the First Estate, because there were clerical delegates who very much agreed with what the National Assembly, or whatever that is, was doing and what was being written in the Society of 30. But as will be primarily his trademark, Talleyrand remained that one step behind the momentum of events to give himself the necessary political cover. Because Talleyrand is absolutely a cynic. That's probably why I like him so much. He was not among those first Estate deputies to defect over to the Third Estate, soon to be the National Assembly. He was not in that first vanguard group of, clerical delegates who said, yeah, we're coming. He only took his seat after that botched royal session where Louis threatened to, everybody, and Mirabeau stood up and all that happened. He didn't take his seat until after that. He didn't actually say, yep, no yes way. He didn't actually go join the National Assembly until after that occurred. And in his own typical fashion, he said this of his decision to move to the National Assembly, quote, "There remained only one rational course of action: to yield freely before being compelled, while one could still earn favor from doing so." End quote. Always the calculator. This is how any cynical survivor would conduct themselves. He looked around and said, well, I need to do this now before I can gain nothing from doing it. It would have been risky to do it prior to now, but I should take the action now before I gain nothing from doing so. That sums up the man really concisely in how he operates. But despite all of his enlightened rationalism and desires for reform, Talleyrand is decidedly not, a revolutionary in the sense that we have understood it thus far. Revolution, from his perspective, is far too messy and unpredictable for one who really planned out his actions fairly practically, and who needed to understand how the dominoes would fall as reasonably as could be understood in advance. So when the crisis of July 1789 hit and the Bastille fell, he actually has, and this is very important for Fixer's Heavy Metal History, episode 4897, he actually had a secret meeting in the palace in the middle of the night before Louis found out the next day with the Comte d'Artois. Talleyrand told d'Artois that if d'Artois and the monarchy wanted to save the monarchy, the only course of action that could be taken would be to violently suppress the insurrection currently occurring in Paris and to break up the National Assembly, which he had just joined, by force. Anything less than those two actions would be the end of the Bourbon dynasty, in Talleyrand's opinion and advice to D'Artois. Turned out that was true. That's a lot of episodes. You don't think you can wait? It's not 4,000. It's probably in the line of 60 episodes from now. But the Comte d'Artois took this advice from Talleyrand to heart. He went to the king with it. But Louis would refuse to take such tyrannical measures. And that's in line with Louis, right? He was always trying to please everybody. That's why he was so wishy-washy. And d'Artois saw that in his brother. And you'll remember that the Comte d'Artois emigrated from France that morning. He had that conversation with Talleyrand, which I never told you about. Told Louis that, here's Talleyrand, one of the best minds of the day, telling us that the only way we're saving ourselves is to boot stomp the insurrection, break up the National Assembly, and get things back the way they're supposed to be. Louis says, nah, I can't do that, man. You know, he just couldn't do it. And d'Artois looks at his brother and says, looks at Talleyrand's advice and says, I'm out of here. And it was a hugely motivating thing to get d'Artois to leave, because he agreed with what Talleyrand had told him, was like, we're screwed. And he got out of town. And it does save the Comte d'Artois, because you'll remember, I've mentioned this a few times, but when the Bourbon Restoration comes around, the Comte d'Artois will eventually become King of France again. And it will take those 25 years, really, for the Comte d'Artois soon later on to be king and Talleyrand to meet again, when the memory of this conversation will secure Talleyrand a very influential position in that restored Bourbon dynasty. So, in the actions, another action of the cynical survivor, kids, plant all the seeds you can, because you never know 25 years from now which ones are going to blossom for you. And Talleyrand was very good at this. Not just giving advice for the sake of advice, but giving good advice to the right people and allowing that later to come back to benefit him. And d'Artois would reward Talleyrand almost 3 decades from that point in 1789. Wait, how can he be a king of France if he was never king to begin with? That's a great question. We'll cover that one in episode 4.2 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History, when we get to the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty right before the July Monarchy. We're going to be in France for a long, long time. Just remember that the king has 2 brothers. Yeah, neither one has been king yet, and d'Artois is the younger brother, but the younger brother will eventually be king of France way down the line, way past Napoleon. We'll get to it, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember Fix talking about this. For now, just realize the conversation that was had the evening that the Bastille fell is extremely important for Talleyrand. We are only in Season 2. Why is this 1.18? So the numbering convention of Fixer's Heavy Metal History is to define era, right? So 1 is the French Revolution. .18 is 18th episode of the French Revolution. When we get to the coup of Brumaire, which is actually the pivot point in my mind of leading into Napoleon, it'll become 2, the Napoleonic era, 2.1. And then we'll get to the Bourbon Restoration, actually probably 3.2. The Bourbon Restoration will be 3, and then the July Monarchy will be 4, and then we'll get to the revolutions of 1848, and that'll be 5. But I needed to give a number, because otherwise it's hard for someone to come back in time, pick out where they want to start if they're trying to catch up, if they don't understand a clear definition of where the eras are. And that's why it's 1.18. That's a good question. I think I said that the first day, but there was so much going on, like on 1.1, that we all missed that. Yeah, eventually episode 425, the number becomes meaningless, but episode 4.25 is far more meaningful. But again, this is the action of a cynical survivor. Talleyrand plants his seed, and it germinates for him and blossoms big time for him later. But again, during his tenure in the National Assembly, Talleyrand was also appointed to one of those all-important roles on the Constitutional Committee, which was drafting that Constitution of 1791. He sat on that committee. And in his early days, that committee, remember, was dominated by Mounier, who Talleyrand would work alongside, but would not follow out the door when they didn't get their way. And Talleyrand would remain on that constitutional committee for the rest of the National Assembly's existence, though he was never its driving force because, as always, he was always one step behind the flow of events to give himself that cover which kept him alive. Because remember, during that time, there's all this conversation about veto, suspensive veto, absolute veto, one-chamber, two-chamber legislatures, and he was involved in all of those conversations. But he was never the guy that led those conversations. He had his opinions. He debated both sides for their merits. He was adept at that. But he was never Mounier. He was never the guy out front saying, my way or the highway, I want this. He never revealed that he had an absolutist position on any of it. And so he remained well-liked and well-respected throughout the entire course of that committee's existence. Smart. Smart of him is something you're going to say very often about him. Yep, the point person is the person people revile the most when they disagree with the point person. But that said, I've kind of harped on the idea that Talleyrand was not the guy who led from the vanguard. He was not that leading edge, front of the wave guy. But on matters of religion, I guess this makes sense too. Talleyrand was further out in front than almost anybody else. You'll recall on October 10th, 1789, I did say, and will remind you now, that he was the first to propose the nationalization of church property, which would then later be rewritten into a more palatable form by Mirabeau in that trick of language, which would then come to form the civil constitution of the clergy. So Talleyrand led the dialogue on that and then let someone else kind of come along and clean it up. But Talleyrand was intimately familiar with the church's portfolio of lands, right? He'd been an agent general, and believed that 2/3 of its holdings would support a reformed church, which is why he advocated for the state to take 1/3 of that property and nationalize it. And hey, let's take it from the monasteries because no one likes them anyway. He thought that 1/3 would be enough to kind of solve the French debt crisis. Yeah, he did so because the other clergy would hesitate to propose a radical idea, and it did have much more weight because here he was, the Bishop of Autun, the first guy to say, hey, maybe we should give up some of this land and help use it to back the nation. It obviously spiraled way out of control politically into the civic oath, but Talleyrand wasn't looking to do that. He was just looking to do the practical thing, which was, there's a whole lot of wealth out there which could be put to use, and if we let the church keep what they need to reform themselves and stay afloat, we can take this money and solve the problem of not being able to pay our bills. Absolutely a practical statement. But these forward-thinking ideas led him to be an early member of the Jacobin Club. But you'll remember, a lot of those early members, including Mirabeau, who was one of their founders, soon drifted over to the far less rabble-filled and rapidly radicalizing Jacobins, and they left that rabble-filled mess, and they went over to the Society of 1789. But Talleyrand stayed out in front on religious matters. He backed the civil constitution when it came into its form, and then wound up being one of only 2 Catholic bishops to take this first civic oath. You missed my point. For a regular member of the assembly to propose would be considered as the state signature. No, I didn't miss your point at all. I said it had more weight because it came from the Bishop of Autun. And he probably was the only member of the clergy willing to propose. He's probably the only member of the clergy who conceived it. But I didn't miss your point at all. That it had much more weight being proposed by a member of the clergy. That the Bishop of Autun saying, hey, take this land from us, the clergy, and use it to solidify the financial status of the nation. Instead of it being, Mounier saying it, it was a bishop saying it, and therefore it had far more weight within not just the assembly, but outside of the assembly. The problem is that most of the actual really devout, pious clergy, they didn't respect Talleyrand at all because they knew who he was. But publicly, it's the Bishop of Autun saying this is okay from a savior, immortal soul perspective. Oh, maybe it is okay. Yeah, that's the point there. But he stayed out in front on the religious matters. Even after the civil constitution of the clergy was passed, which he backed, he also, again, was one of the only of 2 bishops to take that first civic oath. He took it quickly. But because he took that civic oath so willingly, his constituents back in Autun declared him a backstabber. They said, I can't believe that our bishop, our first estate delegate, who we sent, barely knew him, we sent to the National Assembly, well, the States General, but now the National Assembly, to represent us. I cannot believe he would do that and take an oath to the nation over the church. But for this, simply put, Talleyrand said, yeah, I'm done. And he resigned his bishopric. He said, I'm done being a bishop in the Catholic Church. Because he theorized that the momentum of events had become so anti-clerical that it was probably going to be just a matter of time until bishoprics got abolished anyway, and they didn't. But he didn't have any love for the church to begin with. But I bet his fellow delegates in the National Assembly kind of wish that he hadn't defrocked himself basically so fast. He technically was still a member of the clergy at this point. He just wasn't the Bishop of Autun. Because the newly elected constitutional bishops in this new constitution of the clergy would need to be ordained by an existing bishop to secure that legitimizing link of apostolic succession in the Catholic Church. But no ancien regime bishop would ordain these new blasphemous constitutional bishops, so Talleyrand agreed in March 1790 to ordain the first 3 new bishops anyway. And then they could just go ordain the rest. And everyone who wanted this to happen just kind of simply overlooked the fact that Talleyrand wasn't a bishop anymore because he had already resigned his bishopric. They just kind of like, yeah, okay. I guess we're okay with that because we need this to happen. But about the time that Talleyrand, the not a bishop, acting like a bishop, ordains more bishops, is right about the time he gets excommunicated from the Catholic Church by the Pope. Talleyrand celebrates this by eating a meal of cold meat and iced wine because, according to the dogma of the church, good Christians were now supposed to deny him fire and water. So, cold meat and iced wine. But in the daily grind of the National Assembly, Talleyrand spent most of his time enmeshed in securing the financial health of the kingdom. But he was no fan of the drive to rest the financial future of this new order on the anciens, which was that paper money bond that the church property backed, right? He wanted the livre to remain the currency, even though the ancien was rapidly developing into the de facto currency of the revolution. Talleyrand correctly again predicts that becoming reliant upon the ancien would drive France into a destructive period of hyperinflation, which we haven't hit yet, but he knew that the ability to just roll off ancien backed by church property and say, yeah, here you go. We've talked about the changing value here and there, but hyperinflation is a different thing, and it is going to hit the ancien right in the middle reign of terror, basically. When the matters of religion and finance, though, were not consuming his time, when these two focuses, religion, finance, and the Constitution, when they were not the focus of his time within the National Assembly, Talleyrand was spending his time on his great passion project. And again, this is not a self-serving project at all. He wanted to totally reinvent the French public education system. He wanted education for everyone to be free and compulsory. Sound like anything you know? His reporting on this, the investigation into and his resulting report on public education, laid out a remarkably modern program that you and I would likely recognize a huge majority of, but it got buried in the chaos of the coming chaos. Yep, you see why he's an interesting person, Gilly? He's very human, isn't he? But again, this plan to try to get public education, it'll get buried. It will get revived to a degree under Napoleon because Talleyrand's going to be hugely important to Napoleon becoming Napoleon the Emperor that you know of. And his plan, while not adopted now, isn't going to go into a shredder. He's going to hold on to it. In July 1790, the revolutionary leadership, though, was again having a hard time getting a respectable bishop to bless their work. Remember, Talleyrand's no longer a bishop. He's actually no longer a member of the clergy. But specifically, no one would preside over that great feast of the Federation, that first one in July 14, 1790. So the self-defrocked and excommunicated Talleyrand was tapped again to, and over his own doubts that he could even run it properly, to put on the robes of a member of the clergy and conduct that mass that Gilly referred to earlier in chat, where he told Lafayette, "Don't make me laugh." I believe it was said out of fear of messing up the clerical proceedings, which, he probably didn't know. The whole conversation is a little bit apocryphal, meaning there's not solid evidence. No one can actually say, I heard him say it, but it's one of those stories that is fun to tell in the narrative of history, especially given the relationship between the two men. But the point here is that Talleyrand was asked to stand up and conduct a mass at this ceremony when he was not a priest, was not a bishop, but he was supposed to act the part of a bishop. And he did, because no one else could do the job, or would do the job. But Talleyrand spent the rest of the National Assembly and its lifespan I'll wait. What's the question? Yep. You're fine. I'm more than happy to go back over. So when he was decried for taking the civic oath by the people of Autun, he defrocked himself from the role of bishop, but remained clergy. When the following spring, in April 1790, said, yeah, sure, I'll ordain these first 3 constitutional bishops under the civil constitution of the clergy, the Pope went, oh, no, and excommunicated him. And that's when he ceased to be any part of the clergy. So April to July, he's not a bishop, he's not a member of the clergy, yet because they needed somebody with some measure of legitimacy, the people planning the Fête de la Fédération said, hey, Talleyrand, would you mind conducting the Mass? Because you used to be a member of the clergy, and he did. That's what happened. Clear all that up now, because it's a crazy story. Talleyrand. Yeah, dude. Talleyrand spent the rest of the National Assembly's life working on constitutional business. He worked diligently alongside the triumvirate of Lamet, Barnave, and his old intellectual acquaintance from the Society of 30, Duport. The whole time, though, Talleyrand had been angling for a position within the royal ministry, and he eventually is going to have several positions in the Ministry of France down the road, but he had to give that whole dream up when the National Assembly barred its members from serving in dual roles. He also probably would have tried for a seat in the Legislative Assembly, but Robespierre's self-denying decree also made that impossible. So, when the National Assembly dispersed in 1791, Talleyrand found himself out of power and without really a job. He wasn't a member of the clergy anymore. He wasn't a member of the assembly anymore. He didn't have anything to do. But soon enough, and I mentioned this when I introduced him, his old drinking buddy from the days in the streets of Paris when they were younger, the Comte de Narbonne, that just recently appointed Minister of War, right before the Fouillon ministry took over, that Narbonne taps Talleyrand in early 1792 to go to London and act as an unofficial agent and ambassador of the revolutionary government. It had to be unofficial because technically he wasn't allowed to have a position in the ministry. So to launch what would otherwise be a brilliant diplomatic career, this start to it was inauspicious at best. Again, he was barred in serving as an ambassador, so he was sent unofficially to secure British neutrality when France and Austria inevitably went to war with each other in 1792. He gets to London in early 1792. Talleyrand was eager to take the job because he philosophically believed that a commercial and military alliance between Britain and France would be beneficial to both nations. But this first phase of his political diplomatic career turned out to be a personal failure, but a public success. He was received badly by the ministry of William Pitt the Younger. And this is a correction from last week. I said William Pitt the Elder when I referred to this in brief when I talked about Talleyrand's jaunt to Great Britain. But he was received badly by William Pitt the Younger. And even worse by King George III. Same King George III, lost the American colonies. And King George's wife, Charlotte, who literally turned her back on this atheist ex-bishop who all reputable gossip stated he lacked any moral character whatsoever. And that's a big deal. Turning your back on someone at a court is a big deal. But luckily for Talleyrand, Prime Minister Pitt, who my hometown is named after, the elder, had already decided to stay out of the upcoming war on the continent before Talleyrand had ever even gotten to London. So Talleyrand could go back to Narbonne and say that, hey, look what I accomplished, they're going to stay out of it. And his mission was successful. And his influence with the British crown was good, because look what I just got done. Despite him having absolutely nothing to do with Pitt's decision regarding the upcoming Franco-Austrian War, which again would become the War of the First Coalition. So despite being treated poorly and not having any real audience with any of the decision makers in Britain, he got done what he was sent to get done: British neutrality. And for his success, when the war broke out, Talleyrand was sent back to Britain to ensure they remained neutral. And the experience repeated itself with the poor treatment, but Pitt's firmness in remaining neutral and not getting involved on the continent remained. And so it was another successful mission for Talleyrand. And he would use this as a springboard later on in life to say, look at how good of a diplomat I am. Because he's not stupid. He knows he's not getting anything done. But no one else who isn't there really knows how it all went down. And all that people back, especially Narbonne, and the people back in France cared about was, he did what we asked him to do. Look at it. It only took a couple months, and we've got repeated guarantees of British neutrality. He must be good at it. And he was good at it. He will become exceptionally good at it. We'll talk about how exceptionally good at it he will, but here's an example. After Napoleon loses at Waterloo, France has the Allied armies in Paris, right? They are utterly defeated. This isn't sue for peace. It is surrender, right? Talleyrand, being who he is, understands how the Holy Roman Empire works. And so while advocating for France, he begins to advocate for all of the little electors that make up those fringe little principalities in the Holy Roman Empire, and becomes so influential with them, and being the representative of France, he actually gets France a seat at the table to negotiate terms with the Allies in the aftermath of Waterloo, which they didn't have because they were outright surrendering. He is very good at it. He becomes very, very good at it as a diplomat. Yeah, holy cow. He saw the opening was not with the big powers, but the small ones, and convinced them that their interests really laid with France and France's ability to remain secure on their other flank. Convinced them so well that they all got France back to the table to negotiate versus being dictated to at the Treaty of Vienna. It's a big deal, and it's not the only time he will pull that off to such a fantastic degree diplomatically. So we've covered the other major point in Talleyrand's story up to this point. In the wake of the August insurrection, Talleyrand could see the danger for anyone linked to the church or nobility remaining in Paris, and so he sought a passport from Danton, who respected Talleyrand, because Talleyrand needed that passport to get out of Paris. The passport was written in Danton's own hand as Minister of Justice, and Talleyrand escaped Paris one day before the September massacres began. He would spend a brief stint back in London as an émigré before settling in with the French émigré community in Philadelphia, while the waves of the Great Terror we are about to get into sweep over France. We are very, very, very far from being done with Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. He will serve a critical role in the rise of Napoleon when he comes back to France as a part of the Directory, which is the government which will be after the convention. He'll look at the Directory and go, well, this isn't going to last, because he's very insightful, and will identify the next person who is going to be in power in France as Napoleon and work to put him there. He will actively work as the foreign minister of the Directory to get the Directory to collapse to put Napoleon in power. He will also serve as Napoleon's foreign minister for a time. And then, as foreshadowed previously, he will serve in the restoration of the Bourbons. And that midnight conversation that he had with the Comte d'Artois the day the Bastille fell would become a huge lifeline for Talleyrand in his later years as he aged and his influence started to wane. But we'll leave him there for now. Hopefully you found this more detailed perspective on who is absolutely a power player in the broader spectrum of what we're going to cover long term here to be insightful. But we'll come back next week to the National Convention, set aside all of those other initial salvos they fired at each other to try to destroy one another, and focus in completely on the trial of Louis XVI. This next episode next week will focus in on the details that surround the king's conduct throughout the revolution. It will also have us tackle the legal arguments and hurdles which the Constitution itself had to wrangle with as they tried to put a king on trial. And of course, we will cover how all of the competing factions tried to use all of this to further try to destroy each other. But that is the episode for this week. Hopefully you found it to be entertaining, especially this is Talleyrand. It's very hard to just bottle somebody as good or bad. He obviously was a good guy and a bad guy, right? And an interesting guy to be sure. But we have a quiz to get to. And I've got to open a quiz. Let me go ahead and get the quiz document open. Let me re-explain the quiz for those of you that do not know how it works, because we changed things last week when we started Season 2. That is last week's question. Don't worry about it. We'll get that cleared in just a second. I should have done that in advance. The way it works now is it is not a race to be first. The quiz now requires you to use the command !answer to then type your answer afterwards. It can be a very long answer. Way. Yes, way. It can be a very long answer. And in some instances, it should be a long answer. But everyone will have the opportunity to answer the question. I will consider all of your answers individually, as they are all written to a file. From the moment I enter the command question, you will be given a 1-minute timer, which is going to appear right next to me, right here. You have that 1 minute to type !answer, type your answer, and then as you enter that, the command will self-consume, and the answer will not be in chat. Moderators who want to participate in the bonus round for Gilly, you got it. The first question is worth 5 points for Gilly, if he gets it right. Moderators, play fairly. I know that you can see what other people are saying. Put your answer in before looking at chat if you're going to participate. We're all in the honor system, and I trust my moderators, so I'm trusting you to act accordingly there. There's nothing I can do to hide it from the moderators, because they need to see what was deleted otherwise here. Any questions on the new format before we get going with the first question of the night? It seemed to work well last week once everyone got the gist that, hey, it's okay to answer. There is no penalty for getting it wrong, so take a stab. You might get it right, and you might get a point on the board, and I really want everyone who was here tonight to try to answer the questions. All can participate. This new system is designed to make this all more approachable for you so that you feel you have a chance to get an answer in without having to compete with the note takers who are going to be Johnny on the spot with one-word answers. And on that note, many of the questions have now been fashioned in a way that demand a longer answer. Not all of them. Some of them are still statistics or date-based, but many of them are asking for you to think about things. I know you were delaying, Rocket. It did not get past my observation in Season 1 that you were delaying intentionally to give people a chance. But here comes question number 1. 5 points for Gilly if he gets it right, 1 point for everybody else. Exclamation point answer. How old was Talleyrand when he left Paris on the passport provided by Danton in 1792? Exclamation point answer, space, your answer. You have 50 seconds. How old was Talleyrand when he left Paris on the passport provided by Danton in 1792? Take a guess if you don't know. 30 seconds left to answer. Gilly is in, Rocket is in, no one else is in. How old was Talleyrand when he left Paris on the passport provided by Danton in 1792? You have 20 seconds to answer. Manny gets an answer in with 15 seconds left. How old was Talleyrand when he left Paris on the passport provided by Danton in 1792? 5 seconds left. All right. Took me a moment to pull out ye old calculator, says Gilly. So,
My lord.
Go yourself.
fix out how old. I did say how old. 38 years old is correct. Rocket gets it. I believe I made a command for bonus, but I need to go back and look because I forgot what it is. Nope, I didn't. I meant to. We'll just do it by hand. The next answer is from Gilly, I believe. 38 years old, also correct. So here's what we're going to do, Gilly. We're going to give you 4 points in the background. And then I'm going to give you the last point via the got it command so the thing updates. Let us go here. Gillius. You currently are sitting on quiz points 0, right? Yep, so we'll give you the 4 there, and then I'll give you the got it to update the board. That is how we'll do that. Put that back where it goes. Now, this should give you a grand total of 5, and we should be good to go. The Gillius at 5. It worked. The next person to answer was Manny. Manny said 38, and Manny gets it. Manny on the board with 2 points. Now tied with Permanu for 3rd. GG Manny and all who answered. The next question. Again, take your best stab if you're not sure. I would love to see high levels of participation in this system we've written. Here comes question number 2 your way, starting right now. What was the stated purpose of the National Convention when it convened in September 1792? 50 seconds left to go. What was the stated purpose of the National Convention when it convened in September 1792? Gilly gets his answer in with 40 seconds to go. Gilly has redeemed 2 heads with Rocket, meaning if Rocket gets it right, Gilly also gets a point from her answer. Manny gets an answer in 30 seconds to go. What is the stated purpose, or what was the stated purpose of the National Convention when it convened in September 1792? 22 seconds left for anyone else who wants to answer. So far, Manny, Gilly, and Rocket have their answers in. 15 seconds left for anyone else that wants to participate. What was the stated purpose of the National Convention when it convened in September 1792? 5 seconds left. Thought that was an answer ban. Oh. I'm not sure what you're referring to. An answer ban. We'll go to the first answer. To create a new constitution for France from the Gillius, that is correct. Oh, no. That was 2 heads. The other is lockout. You'll see lockout on a Price is Right tag if you're locked out. The Gillius gets his answer correct. Let's go to the second one. It is... You can still answer, by the way. I'll just ignore it if you're locked out, right? If you are locked out and still want to answer to test yourself, you can answer. But if you're locked out, I will not award you the point. That's really what the point of it. Elected government, elected to provide a new constitution for the country after the overthrow of the monarchy. That is correct, Manny. GG Manny. And the next entry comes from Rocket, I believe. To write a constitution for a republic. That is also correct. So Rocket gets that. And we also have to give Gilly a point for the 2 heads card. So that is Rocket at 10, Gilly at 7, Manny at 3, Permanent at 2, Arky at 1. As we go to only the third question of many tonight. Sturf is out of town on work business this week. I'm not sure if she's back home yet, but that is where she is this week. I'm not sure about last week. But everyone has their thing. And as you just demonstrated, Gilly, proper use of cards, you caught up pretty quickly. The next question number 3, starts right now. What is the reason Talleyrand was directed to a career in the church? 50 seconds. What is the reason Talleyrand was
Remember to
directed
clonk
to
that
a
follow
career
button.
in the church? Don't forget to clonk that follow button with 40 seconds left. The reason Talleyrand was directed to a career in the church, with 35 seconds left to go on the clock. Rocket gets her answer in. What is the reason Talleyrand was directed to a career in the church with 25 seconds left to go? 20 seconds left. What is the reason Talleyrand was directed to a career in the church? Permanoob gets an answer in. 10 seconds to go. Better get those answers in because it will get marked in the file if you don't answer in time. Time is... Oh, Gilly! Oh, that's going to be close, man. I'm not sure if you beat the buzzer on that one. That is going to be close. Manny did not get in time, but we will show how that system works. His family disinherited him due to his permanent lip to exclude him in life, a life in the army. He was... It's fair. It's accurate enough. He had a debilitating limp from the time he was a toddler, and it precluded him the ability to serve in the military. So yes, he was disinherited. So that after he was directed to a life in the church, that answer is correct. I would say it's like 95% correct. So we'll give it to Rocket. Rocket to 11. The next answer comes from, I believe, Hermanu, right? His bum leg. That is also correct. His bum leg is what directed him to a career in the church. That is also a good answer. Hermanoob to 3. Outstanding. The next answer comes from Gilly. He could not take a military career due to his disability, was instead led to the church to hopefully succeed his uncle, the Archbishop of Reims. Reims spelled wrong, but that is also an accurate way to phrase that, and a correct answer. And let's see if Manny... I don't think Manny beat the buzzer. That is the end of valid answers, but let's have a look at Manny's answer anyway. Wished the First Estate to cooperate with the transformation of the old regime into a new order. That is also not a correct answer, so regardless of the timeout, that would be incorrect. But good attempt. Talking about his early life and why he could not become a soldier like his father wanted. The next question is this. Starting right now. At best, what was the voter turnout for the elections to the National Convention? Rocket in with an answer with 52 seconds left. Gilly gets his answer in 45 seconds to go. At best, what was the voter turnout for the elections to the National Convention? With 40 seconds to go. Yep, number. I'm trying to mix it up. I'm trying to provide an easy to recall and make you think questions. 25 seconds to go. At best, what was the voter turnout for the elections to the National Convention? 15 seconds to go. It's a number. You can throw that number in there with a percent sign and take a big guess with 10 seconds to go. Manny gets one in. 5 seconds left. Just toss a number in a percent sign after the word answer. Manny, Gilly, and Rocket again get an answer in. Let's go see what they said. 20% at best is the best figure for the first assembly electoral turnout for the National Convention elections. That is correct for Rocket. The next question, or the next answer, from Gilly. 20% at best. That is also correct. So while I'm typing in some of this stuff, I'm assuming you guys like this new format. I like it because it seems that people were participating, and I'd just like to get another 5 people to get one right so we can get some of those random names off the bottom of the board. Manny also threw a number out there. 21%. So here's how I'm going to rule this. 21% is not right. I have seen at least 6 sources about this. No, it's not a typo. I've seen at least 6 sources on this, and none of them even give me a percentile that will allow me to round to 21%. 20% seems to be the consensus, so that is not right. That's okay. It's a really close, really close. And if it had been a range question, we probably would have thrown that in there. The next question for everybody vying for points on the leaderboard coming your way. Once I fix 2 typos in it, that question still has a typo. Let me fix that real quick. I really should start proofreading these instead of just firing them in there quickly on a Saturday afternoon. Now, here comes the next question your way, and the timer starts now. What is the only political issue that Talleyrand did not remain in his methodical, quote, one step behind the vanguard, quote, on the National Assembly? Within the National Assembly. What is the only political issue that Talleyrand did not remain his methodical one step behind the vanguard on within the National Assembly? 42 seconds left on the clock. The one political issue that Talleyrand did not remain his typical and methodical one step behind the vanguard on within the National Assembly. 27 seconds left to go. 20 seconds left to go. What is the only political issue that Talleyrand did not remain his methodical one step behind the vanguard on within the National Assembly? Gilly is in with 10 seconds to go as the only person to answer. 5 seconds left. Gilly, the only person to answer. Proposing that the government take church property for the state to assist in debt recovery. That's pretty specific. The church would have been good enough. He was out in front on church matters. Anything about church reform would have been good enough. But that is also correct. He was way out in front on that church matter. Gilly at the point moves within 2 of Rocket. The next question coming your way. Sure, it also means a political issue with respect to how do we deal with other matters within the Constitution, like a veto or the bicameral legislature. That would be a constitutional issue. Church being an issue. It's however you want to look on it. You don't have to take notes, Manny. Again, take your best stab, right? I mean, there's no degree being awarded here. This is all fun and games for competition on a board. Take your best stab. This whole system was redesigned to encourage people to take their best stab. Have fun with it. Just don't troll me with anything that is, offensive in the answers, because this is for people later too. The next question, and the timer starts right now. In your own words, describe why one might be reticent to participate in the election for the National Convention. Sorry, I did it wrong. It should be convention. So listen to how I'm saying it, not how I've written it. In your own words, describe why one might be reticent to participate in the election for the National Convention. In your own words, describe why one might be reticent to participate in the election for the National Convention. 20 seconds left to go. Gilly with an answer in. Rocket with an answer in. In your own words, describe why one might be reticent to participate in the election for the National Convention. 15 seconds to go. I apologize for the typo. In your own words, describe why one might be reticent to participate in the election for the National Assembly with 5 seconds left on the clock. First answer comes from Gilly. Mob justice could mean that your vote could be used against you in a fatal way. It is an assembly, but the National Assembly is actually a thing. The National Constituent Assembly. And I believe everyone knows within the context of the episode that I meant convention, which is why I quickly corrected it on the fly, but that is correct. Mob justice, or the law of suspects, could mean that your vote could be used against you in a fatal way. That is correct. The next answer comes from Rocket. The people were scared they would be arrested and that most likely executed later. For what? For voting? Fair enough. We'll give it to Rocket. Sigh. You think your nephew's computer may be infected by a virus. All the shortcuts on a desktop try to open Windows Media Player, and changing file associations don't seem to be fixing the issues. That is weird, Sigh. The next question coming your way, and I'm going to reread it to make sure there's no typos in it. There is one typo in it. Yep, there's one thing in there that I got wrong. The question coming your way starts now with 60 seconds on the clock. Go. What advice did Talleyrand give to D'Artois the evening of the fall of the Bastille as the only course to save the monarchy? What advice did Talleyrand give to D'Artois the evening of the fall of the Bastille as the only course to save the monarchy? Manny with an answer in with 40 seconds left to go. Rocket gets her answer in. Gilly with an answer in. What advice did Talleyrand give to D'Artois the evening of the fall of the Bastille as the only course to save the monarchy? 30 seconds left to go for anyone else that wishes to answer. Get on that leaderboard. What advice did Talleyrand give to D'Artois the evening of the fall of the Bastille as the only course to save the monarchy with 15 seconds left to go? Ten seconds left. And time is up. The first answer comes from get out of town. That is not the advice. Although he would do that the very next day, that is not the advice necessary to save the monarchy. The next answer. To boot stomp the resistance and disband the National Assembly. From Rocket. Yes, that is correct. To boot stomp the mobs in Paris and disband the National Assembly as the only course to save the monarchy. Violently boot stomp the mobs. Rocket gets it right. The next answer comes from that the only way to save the Bourbon dynasty was to violently put down the mob and disband the National Assembly. Almost verbatim as I said it, Gilly. Yes, that is correct. Competitive Gilly has dragon speaking open during my dictation of my notes and outline. Yes, that is correct. The next question coming your way. Nope. The next question coming your way and the clock starts. So I fixed a typo. Would be smart, but doesn't help me learn. Wait, we can do that? All right, the next question at 60 seconds on the clock starts right now. How many delegates to the National Assembly and Legislative Assembly as separate values were elected to the National Convention? How many delegates to the National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly as separate values were elected to the National Convention? With 45 seconds left. Gilly gets his answer in. Rocket gets her answer in with 25 seconds left to go. Basically asking for two numbers here. How many delegates to the National Assembly and Legislative Assembly as separate values were elected to the National Convention? With 15 seconds left. Ten seconds. You got to put the word answer in there. No one else answers, so it's not a big deal. So here's the thing. That answer from Manny, you can't delete that because Manny's a mod. You have to put the word answer in there. We're going to deal with that one because this is the first time that's happened. So the first time it happens, I'm not going to yell at anybody, right? And that answer is right. 200 from the 200 from the Legislative Assembly and 80 from the National. That is right. I will give it to you, Manny. In the future, you do that again, I will not count it. Just as a heads up, I also cannot delete that message because you're on our moderator. So moderators, please be very careful about accidentally not putting the word exclamation point answer in there. The next answer comes from Intent Rocket. 200 from the Legislative and 80 from the National Assembly. That is correct. And make sure I don't hit my caps lock there. It's okay to be a doofus, Manny. You just put exclamation point answer on your clipboard, and then exclamation point answer space on your clipboard, and just start typing. Intent Rocket gets that one right. The next answer comes from, I believe, Gilly. 200 from the Legislative and 80 from the National. That is correct. The next question. Coming your way. Once I put it into chat and proofread it really quickly. Coming at your way right now with 60 seconds on the clock. Starts right now. Apart from church reform and writing the Constitution of 1791, what was Talleyrand's passion project? 50 seconds on the clock. Apart from church reform and writing the Constitution of 1791, what was Talleyrand's passion project? With 40 seconds on the clock, Gilly and Rocket are in. Apart from the church reform and writing the Constitution of 1791, what was Talleyrand's passion project? With 30 seconds left to go. "20 seconds left. Apart from church reform and writing the Constitution of 1791, what was Talleyrand's passion project?" 10 seconds left. Manny gets an answer in. Winding down. No one else answering. Time is up. The first answer comes from Rocket. Public schools. School reform? Yes. Rocket gets it right. The next answer comes from reinventing the French public education system. Absolutely the correct answer. Gilly gets it. The next answer comes to us from Manny. Public education system for the French. Absolutely correct, Manny. Alrighty, all three of you got it right. The next question. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 left. Once I fix yet another typo. I should probably write these in Google Docs. Because I don't spell check in Notepad. The next question coming your way with 60 seconds on the clock is now. On what date did the National Convention hold its first session in the Menage? Something interesting happened to you. You can tell me after you put your answer in, Rocket, with 45 seconds left. On what date did the National Convention hold its first session in the Menage? That is not shout out. Well, Rocket just gave all of you a helping hand. There we go. Thank you very much, Rocket. "17 seconds left. Only one entry in. What date did the National Convention hold its first session in the Menage?" I think that's the first time I put the word Menage on the screen, too. Yeah, it's an honor system thing where you can either look up at the chat or you can look down where you're typing. And if you want to play fairly, look down. There are moments where I catch your answers being put in as well. Just look down or type in Notepad and then bring it over. Up to you how you want to proceed with that. This is the best I can do with respect to deleting the messages. I can't have you input them without them coming through the bot, and they have to come in through the bot through chat. So the first answer is what Rocket also put in chat. September 21st, 1792. It was designed to be a trick because they did go to the Tuileries Palace on September 20th, which could be argued to be the first day, but the first session was held on the 21st. So Gilly gets it right. I caught your trick, sir. The next answer. That is the end of valid answers. Manny did not get his in time. 10 September 1792, also not correct regardless. So no harm there. The next question, don't forget, it's exclamation point answer, space, and then your answer. You have 60 seconds on the clock to answer this question starting right now. In your own words, why were Talleyrand's dealings with the ministry of William Pitt the Younger a personal failure, but a professional success? So no worries, Rocket. I'm just saying it out loud because it's happened twice tonight. I'm not highlighting anybody. Just a reminder. Exclamation point answer. Space. In your own words, why were Talleyrand's dealings with the ministry of William Pitt the Younger a personal failure, but a professional success? With 30 seconds left on the clock. In your own words, why were Talleyrand's dealings with the ministry of William Pitt the Younger a personal failure but a professional success? 20 seconds on the clock. No one in yet with 15 seconds on the clock. Might want to think about hitting enter soon. Gilly, Rocket, get in. I think seeing it for that flash of a second is also not a big deal for longer answers anyway. The first answer comes to us from Rocket. Even though he was introduced badly, he was still able to keep Britain out of the war. He actually didn't keep Britain out of the war. He had nothing to do, again, with keeping Britain out of the war. William Pitt the Younger had already decided to keep Britain out of the war. So Talleyrand didn't influence them in any way. That's his personal failure. But he could go back to France and say the mission, which was keeping Britain out of the war, was successful, which he had no hand in. So he was not able personally to keep Britain out of the war. So that's not correct. Gilly. English monarchy hated him, but stayed neutral anyway. He was any to claim success as or able to claim success as a result. That's an accurate answer, assuming any means able. The English monarchy hated him and stayed neutral anyway. Yes, true. And he was able to claim success as a result, even though he didn't have anything to do with it. That's correct. Gilly moves into a tie with Rocket. The next question, with 2 left on the board, and now there's a tie for first place. Coming your way right now. 60 seconds. Why was the election of Jérôme Pétion as the first president of the convention a public rebuke of the insurrectionary commune?
No way!
Yes, wait, that's the question. With 45 seconds left. Why was the election of Jérôme Pétion as the first president of the convention a public rebuke of the insurrectionary commune? With 35 seconds left. Don't forget, exclamation point, answer, space, and then your answer. Would still like to see more than 4 people getting involved here. Though I do like this new system more. Rocket's got her answer in with 22 seconds left. Why was the election of Jérôme Pétion as the first president of the convention a public rebuke of the insurrectionary commune? Time is up. Oh, Gilly, did you get in? Did Gilly get in? Oh, you played with fire with that buzzer twice tonight. First answer from Rocket. Because they had told him as the mayor of Paris to stay away. Fair enough. They had usurped his government is the more accurate statement. But yes, that's fair enough. They had told him as the mayor of Paris to stay away. Or they had effectively torn apart the government which he had led as the Paris Commune government. That is good enough. We'll give that answer to Rocket. Did Gilly beat the buzzer? Let's see what happens now. Gilly. He was seated by the mountain, I think. No, that is not correct. He was the second mayor of Paris, and the insurrectionary commune effectively ousted his government. So that when he was seated in the National Convention and the Girondins got him into the chair as the first president, it was basically the finger back to the insurrectionary commune saying he's still a guy that matters. His government is what you try to destroy, your government, which we think is a threat to us. Yeah, no problems. That's why the question exists. I did go into it a little bit during the episode, but it was one of those questions that you have to think about. The very last question for tonight. Rocket now back in the lead by 1 point. And what has been a heated rally from Gilly to catch up using some of the cards. Let's fix one typo. The last question. With 60 seconds on the clock starting right now. What was Georges Danton's political vulnerability within the convention after he had resigned as Minister of Justice? With 50 seconds left. What was Georges Danton's political vulnerability within the convention after he had resigned as Minister of Justice? Gilly has his answer in with 38 seconds left. What was Georges Danton's political vulnerability within the convention after he resigned as Minister of Justice? Rockets in with 30 seconds left. "24 seconds left to get your answer in. What was Georges Danton's political vulnerability within the convention after he had resigned as Minister of Justice? Less than 10 seconds. Want to hit enter if you're typing. Manny gets in under the buzzer. First answer comes to us from his sloppy bookkeeping. Correct. Where did the 550,000 livres go? It's not the first time. It is the first time, but not the last time. And it's from Gilly, not Rocket. It is the first time, but not the last time this matter is going to rear its ugly head for Danton. Rocket's answer. Horrible bookkeeping. Correct. Rocket will walk out tonight the 1-point leader in Season 2. Manny. He was disorganized. Not specific enough. I'm sorry. It has to be specifically
Remember
about
to clonk that
bookkeeping
follow
or money. Disorganization, he actually wasn't all that disorganized. He just didn't keep track of where that money went. So I can't give that one to you, my friend. But good attempt. I can see the intent there. You kind of knew what the problem was. You just weren't specific as to the monetary side of it. So that will not be sufficient. But that will also end the quiz for tonight. So as always, thank you all very much. I need to make one change to the outro, which I haven't made yet. It's because I've been playing New World, isn't it? It probably has something to do with it. But as always, I appreciate your time and attention this evening for another episode of History. I'm glad you are all still enjoying it and finding some of the storylines pretty fascinating. Rocket has never used a card. You're going to use that as your thing? Like if you beat him because you've never used a card? That's fine. I mean, if you don't want to buy cards or use free packs, I don't care, Rocket. But they're there to be fair game, to kind of equalize the playing field. Gilly had to miss a week. That's how he caught up, and that's absolutely fair. It's why those cards are there. But we don't have anybody out there that I really, really want to raid. I've raided Storm the Bard twice and not felt that come back in kind. So we're not going to go there. Does anybody have a recommendation? Oh, I'll get the Destiny card, says Rocket. Does anybody have a destination for a raid they'd like us to go to tonight? Because I don't see anybody really in here that I want to go raid. No one, no one, no one. Let's see if there's anybody under history real quick. History live. Nope. Is anybody under the history tag that I can go see? That is live right now. No. And let's see if there's anybody under educational that I can go. Oh, I didn't even put educational in here tonight. Awesome. See if there's any veterans. Let's go there. See if there's any veterans we can go raid. Nope. Not that it's playing a game. Everyone's in New World, and I'm not going there. Okay, so we're just going to call it a night then, and you guys have a great night. Anyone who wants to hang out with me in voice in a while, I'll be running 1320 Legendary Lost Sector, trying to get myself a pair of Lucky Pants. But other than that, you guys have a good evening. We'll get to the outro, and I will talk to you all Monday for Next Destiny stream at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, barring a work break and trying to raise more money for Stop Soldier Suicide. Good luck with the Lucky Pants. Yes, indeed, Lucky Pants. All right. There's a good friend, Dustin. It's now streaming Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 10:30 a.m. Dustin has stopped streaming on Saturday mornings. That's fine. Catch him Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Permanoob streaming Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. There he is in chat as well. Make sure you give Permanoob a follow. And Dustin, Permanoob, I'm not sure what you're doing Monday. I think it might be more Minecraft. There's Gilly streaming in the evenings, beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, often leading into me on Friday nights. Thank you very much for those raids as well, my friend. There is Intent Rocket streaming Tuesdays, Thursdays, and now a little bit earlier in the morning on Saturday, Eastern Time. Make sure you give Rocket a follow. Big participant in history streams. Thank you very much as well. There's Surfers, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time-ish. She's late. She eats a bean. Make sure that she doesn't try to use that 5-minute grace period rule on you because it doesn't exist anymore. And there's a good friend, Omega Jake, raising money for extra life, raising enough money already to buy one CareView NICU monitor for Beaumont Children's Hospital. Make sure you give them a follow as well. We're out of here. Have a good weekend, and I love you all.
Be excellent to each other.